Welcome to today's video. This is a one-off video format as we will continue our typical format for other videos. We are thrilled to present the Iceberg video format. This unique style of video is designed to take you on a journey, starting at the top of the iceberg and delving deeper into its layers. As this is wicked psychology, today's focus is on female serial killers. At the top of the iceberg, we will explore cases where females fit the definition of a serial killer in a more straightforward manner. As we continue our descent through the iceberg's layers, we will delve into the cases of female serial killers who have committed hundreds of murders, with each case becoming more heinous than the last. The definition of serial killer that we are going to follow is someone who has killed 3 or more victims. We would like to emphasize that we are fully aware that all murders are terrible and tragic. The ranking of the cases is only intended to complement the iceberg format and make it easier to understand the progression of the cases. This topic all started because I was taken aback by the realization that I couldn't name a single female serial killer off the top of my head. As I embarked on researching female serial killers for this iceberg video, what I discovered was truly eye-opening. When it comes to true crime stories, we only see the tip of the iceberg. The same can be said for the clothing that we wear. We are excited to introduce Elate shorts, the perfect blend of comfort, durability, and functionality. These comfy shorts are perfect for any activity. The comfortable and convenience of Elate shorts is just the tip of the iceberg. The lightweight and breathable material keeps you cool and dry, while the side slits allow for easy movement and flexibility. Try them for yourself and discover the rest of the benefits that lie beneath the surface. Receive 15% off with the code 15WICKED at checkout. That's 15WICKED. You can find the link in the description below. Okay, now let's delve into the layers of the female serial killer iceberg. Dorothy Williams. Dorothy Williams was responsible for the deaths of 3 elderly people during robberies in Illinois between 1987 and 1990. Dorothy was a drug addict, used the money she made during the robberies to buy heroin. On July 25, 1989, she strangled 97-year-old Mary Harris to death. Dorothy's heinous crimes earned her a death sentence, which was later commuted to life in prison without the possibility of parole in 2003 by Governor George Ryan of Illinois. George Ryan was concerned with capital punishment in the state and commuted the sentences of everyone on death row. Dorothy Williams spent the rest of her life in custody. She died 5 days after her 66th birthday, leaving behind a legacy of violence and heartbreak. Williams's crimes have left a lasting impact on the families and communities of her victims, who will never forget the pain and suffering she caused. Clara Green Carl. Clara Green Carl was an American writer and convicted murderer born in May 1877. She gained notoriety in 1922 after being found guilty of poisoning her second husband, Frank Carl, and his father, Alonzo Carl. Due to her actions, Clara earned the nickname Feminine Bluebeard and was considered one of the most daring female criminals in the country. Clara and her childhood sweetheart, Robert Gibson, eloped. Robert worked as a teacher while Clara became a writer for a newspaper. They came up with a get-rich-quick scheme, writing and selling books about local historic areas. Later, Robert became ill and died in March 1920, leaving Clara a widow and the sole beneficiary of a $3,000 life insurance policy. A few months after her first husband's death, Clara met and married Frank Carl in September 1920, under the impression that he was wealthy. Their relationship was tumultuous, and Clara filed for divorce, which Frank prevented. Clara was the sole beneficiary of his $2,000 life insurance policy. In 1921, Clara and Frank invited Frank's elderly father, Alonzo Carl, to come live with them in Philadelphia. Alonzo became gravely ill, suffering from the same illness as his father. Suspicious actions led neighbors to demand an investigation, and both bodies were exhumed, revealing enough arsenic to kill 12 men in each man's system. During her trial, Clara was found guilty of second-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. Evidence revealed that Clara had bought arsenic. claiming it was to kill neighborhood cats that were stealing her chickens. While in prison, Clara made a daring and cunning escape in October 1925. She was assigned to outdoor work and was trusted after 3 years of good behavior. Clara climbed up and hopped the prison wall to escape, but was recaptured a week later. At age 54, Clara was paroled on May 26, 1937, 15 years after being convicted of murder. Bertha Alice Williams was born in Morse Mill, Missouri. She was one of 10 children, and she married Henry Graham, with whom she had a daughter named Lila. After Graham's death, she married Eugene Gifford, and they had a son named James. Gifford was well known in her community for her cooking skills and taking care of sick neighbors. Bertha was well known in her community for her cooking skills and taking care of sick neighbors and relatives. However, her reputation took a dark turn when 5 people under her care died. This led to an investigation that revealed large amounts of arsenic in the bodies. In 1928, Bertha was arrested and charged with their murders. Bertha was accused of murdering 3 people. However, suspicions were only raised about the additional deaths after the initial investigation. Due to the high mortality rates and the amateur use of arsenic for medical reasons at the time, it is impossible to determine whether she intentionally killed those under her care. Anna Zwanziger. Anna Zwanziger was a German serial killer who used arsenic as her preferred method of murder. She was employed as a housekeeper from 1801 until 1811. During her employment, Anna would poison her employers with arsenic and then nurse them back to health to gain their favor. She was able to poison 3 people and attempted to poison several others. Unfortunately, she was successful in killing 4 people, including a baby. She was sentenced to death for her crimes. However, before she was beheaded, she admitted that she probably would not have been able to stop killing if she had not been caught. This statement highlighted the severity of her psychological issues, as she seemed to have no qualms about taking innocent lives. Anna's case was particularly disturbing because she took advantage of her position of trust to commit her heinous crimes. As a housekeeper, she was given access to the homes of her victims and was able to move around undetected, making it easier for her to carry out her plans. Her use of arsenic was particularly insidious. This allowed her to gain the trust of her victims, who believed she was nursing them back to health. Annette Lyles. Annette Lyles was an American born as Annette Donovan on August 23, 1925. Lyles was an entrepreneur and owned a restaurant named Annette's. She was known to be a successful businesswoman and a loving mother of 2 daughters. However, her facade of being a kind and loving person was shattered when her family members began to die under suspicious circumstances, and her story still haunts the town decades later. She owned a popular diner where lawyers, judges, and other folks would come to enjoy her delicious southern fare. However, over 6 years, 4 of Lyle's immediate family members had died from what appeared to be natural causes. In May 1958, Bibb County deputies arrested Lyles and charged her with the murders of all 4 family members, including her 9-year-old daughter. The murders were committed using small doses of arsenic administered through food and drink. Investigators found voodoo paraphernalia, candles, potions, and powders, along with bottles of taro ant killer, in her home. The pesticide contains arsenic, the same chemical found in the bodies of each of Lyle's dead family members. During her trial, the prosecution presented evidence that Lyle spent money like, quote, a drunken sailor. She reportedly bought herself a new white Cadillac with her second husband's life insurance payout. The prosecution also brought in a handwriting expert who testified that the signature on Julia Lyle's will was forged. Despite trying to charm the all-male jury into believing she did not commit the murders, Lyle was found guilty and sentenced to death. However, she was never executed because the governor refused to sign a death warrant for a white woman. The case was shocking to the residents of the town. Mackin, playwright Denver Pickard, stated that to kill a 9-year-old child takes a sociopathic mind that goes beyond any pale of the imagination and narcissistic behavior. The case drew hundreds of spectators and reporters from around the world. The case of Elate Lyles is a bizarre one that has become the plot of books, plays, and TV specials. Lyles was accused of killing both of her husbands and her mother-in-law, in addition to her daughter. Her welcoming personality and delicious food were enjoyed by many in town, making the murders even more shocking. But as Pickard said, it was money that drove Lyles to commit the murders. Sharon Keene, born as Sharon Elizabeth Hall, is an American murderer and prison escapee who was convicted in Mexico for one murder and is suspected of 2 others in the United States. She was given the name La Pistolero in Mexico, and as of 2022, she holds the record for the longest outstanding arrest warrant for murder in the history of Kansas City, Missouri, and one of the longest outstanding felony warrants in U.S. history. On March 19, 1960, Sharon's husband, James Keene, was found shot in the head with their 2-year-old daughter nearby. Sharon claims that the child, who often played with James's guns, had accidentally shot him. Police could not initially disprove her story. However, on May 27th, 23-year-old Patricia Jones, a local file clerk, was dead in a secluded area by Sharon and her boyfriend. Investigators discovered that Jones was the wife of one of Sharon's boyfriends. Upon investigation, Sharon admitted to being the last person to speak to Patricia and was charged with her murder. Sharon was tried for Patricia's murder in June 1961 and was acquitted. A trial on charges of murdering her husband ended in conviction and a sentence of life in prison. But the verdict was overturned due to procedural irregularities. A second trial ended in a mistrial within days. Following the third trial, Sharon was released on bond and fled to Mexico before her scheduled 4th trial in October 1964. Sharon claimed to have acted in self-defense and killed a man named Francisco Ordonez. He was shot in the back, and an employee of the hotel in which the shooting occurred was also wounded but survived. The investigation into the shooting showed that Francisco was shot with the same weapon that killed Patricia. Sharon was convicted of killing Francisco and sentenced to 10 years in prison, which was later extended to 13 years after judicial review. She escaped from prison during a blackout in December 1969, and despite extensive manhunts, her whereabouts remain unknown. Hattie Whitten. Hattie Whitten was an American serial killer who killed her husband and 2 daughters in the early 20th century. Little is known about Hattie's early life, but she came from a respectable family in Maine and was married to Harry E. Whitten, with whom she had 3 children. Harry died under suspicious circumstances, likely from poisoning by his wife. In the following years, Hattie's behavior becomes odd due to the morphine addiction. In September 1902, the Whittens moved, and Hattie ran a boarding house for a brief time. On September 19th, their 11-year-old daughter Fanny died suddenly, and her death was ruled as meningitis. Hattie had insured her daughter and received $85 from the insurance company. A few months later, 9-year-old Jenny also died suddenly, supposedly from heart failure. But Jenny was insured for $50 by her mother, and traces of arsenic and strychnine were found in her body. Hattie was issued an arrest warrant for murder. Hattie was arrested at her home, returning from her daughter's funeral. While in custody, Fanny's body was exhumed and tested, and it is suspected that there were traces of poison in her body as well. Hattie was arraigned before the court date for Jenny's murder and was held in custody. When the officer found her lifeless body, he called in medical staff to help resurrect her, but to no avail. Sometime after her death, peculiar facts were revealed, including a possible motive for her filicides. Hattie had been courted by a weaver named Serto, but he refused to engage with a woman who had children of her own. This likely led to Wynn's decision to end their children's lives. Circumstantial evidence supporting her guilt was also disclosed. The day prior to Fanny's death, she was seen buying laudanum, arsenic, and castor oil. Hattie was seen buying the arsenic she would later kill her daughter with. Martha Ann Bowen. Martha Ann Bowen is a convicted American serial killer from Georgia. Jones was suspected of killing 3 of her children and was convicted of smothering to death another one of her children in 1982. She was already on her 3rd marriage. Martha claimed that her 23-month-old son, James, was unresponsive when she attempted to wake him up from a nap. He was rushed to the hospital where he was pronounced dead, and the cause of death was determined to be sudden infant death syndrome, SIDS. Johnson claimed that her 3-month-old daughter, Tabitha, was blue when she went to wake her up from a nap. Paramedics were unable to revive Tabitha, and her death was also attributed to SIDS. A few months later, Martha's 2-year-old son, Earl, was found with a package of rat poison. About a month later, Earl went into cardiac arrest while being taken to the hospital during a seizure. He was revived and placed on life support. However, doctors pronounced him brain dead, and he was removed from his life support 3 days later. Johnson claimed that her 11-year-old daughter, Jenny, was complaining of chest pains, and a doctor prescribed Tylenol and a rib belt. However, paramedics found Jenny face down on Martha's bed and were unable to resurrect her. An autopsy indicated that Jenny had died of suffocation. Martha was arrested on July 3, 1989, after an article in the Atlanta Constitution questioned the deaths, and the cases were reopened. Martha confessed to killing 2 of her children after being confronted, stating that she suffocated them by rolling her 250-pound body on them as they slept. Martha claimed that the motive was to punish her husband and that she was not responsible for the deaths. However, by the beginning of her trial in April 1990, Martha had retracted her confession. On May 5, 1990, Martha was convicted of murder for the smothering death of one of her children and was sentenced to life in prison. She remained in prison until she was granted parole in 2020. Francisca Ballesteros. Francisca was born in Valencia in 1969 and later moved. She met and married Antonio Gonzalez, and together they had a daughter, Florinda. However, Francisca suffered from postpartum depression in 1990, and she considered ending her life. Ultimately, she decided against it. She began by poisoning her 5-month-old daughter with Calm, a drug used to treat alcoholism, but she waited to kill the rest of her family. 14 years later, in 2004, and attempted to kill her 12-year-old son, Antonio. He survived, but the autopsy revealed that Sandra had been poisoned. In 2005, she was sentenced to 84 years in prison for her crimes. Alfred Blowensteiner. Alfred was an Austrian serial killer who became known as the Black Widow. She was responsible for murdering at least 3 victims through poison, in each case inheriting their possessions before gambling away their money, which had been left to her in their fabricated wills. Although Alfred was only convicted of 3 of the murders, Austrian police suspect that she may have killed at least 10 people. Alfred was found guilty of murdering a 77-year-old and was sentenced to life in prison. Her former lawyer was sentenced to 7 years in prison for forging wills and being an accomplice to grievous bodily harm. Alfred claimed that her addiction to gambling was a contributing factor in her murders, which were carried out for financial gain. Despite being sentenced to life in prison, Alfred served less than 7 years before dying from a brain tumor. Mary Clement. Mary was the second of 5 daughters of Michael and Margaret. Her family immigrated to the United States in 1871. Mary was described as slender, pretty, and prepossessing in manner, but she only had partial control over her legs and feet due to a spinal column defect. Beginning in 1880, Mary's sister Annie died suddenly, followed by her parents and sister in similar circumstances. All of them died from convulsions or heart failure after suffering through an unidentifiable illness. However, Mary was never charged in their deaths. In 1885, 2 months after the burial of her father, Mary moved in with her sister Catherine's family in Illinois. Mary cooked meals for the family on several occasions, and each time they would be overtaken by violent vomiting and spasms. Catherine's husband grew suspicious of Mary after she always refused to eat any of the soup she served. He found a pack of grayish-colored powder in the backyard. Catherine's husband brought the powder and the plates for an analysis, revealing that the powder contained arsenic. Mary was arrested shortly after this discovery. While imprisoned, Mary initially protested that she was innocent, but later confessed to poisoning her sister's family and killing her mother, father, and sister. At her trial, with her sister's husband as the main witness and several people presenting evidence of arsenic poisoning, Mary was quickly sentenced. However, she only received a year in jail. The following month, she wrote a letter confessing to her crimes, including her youngest sister's murder. After her release from prison, Mary moved to Los Angeles and worked as a domestic servant for a wealthy family. She never spoke of her past, but was known as a nice lady who liked to wear elaborate hats. Mary died at the age of 81 and was buried on the same family plots of whom she killed, right alongside her victims. Sophie Ursinus. Sophie Ursinus was a German serial killer who was believed to have poisoned her husband, aunt, and lover. Her trial led to the development of a method to identify arsenic poisoning. Sophie was the daughter of the secretary of the Austrian legation. She married a much older counselor of the Supreme Court, Theodore. After her husband died suddenly in 1800, Sophie came under suspicion for not summoning a doctor. Sophie had an affair with a Dutch officer named Roget during her marriage, possibly with her husband's consent. Roget died 3 years before her husband, and at the time, his death was attributed to tuberculosis. It was later discovered that Sophie had purchased arsenic shortly before his death. Sophie's aunt, Christine, died after a short illness, leaving Sophie a large inheritance. It was later discovered that Sophie had purchased a large quantity of arsenic shortly before her aunt's death. Later, Sophie's servant, Benjamin, became ill after having a quarrel with her. The soup Sophie gave him to feel better made him worse. After Sophie gave him soup, which made him worse, he became suspicious and had some plums she gave him secretly examined by a chemist, who confirmed that they contained arsenic. Sophie was arrested and soon came under suspicion of having poisoned her husband and aunt. She was charged with murder. Martha Wise. Martha Wise was an American serial killer who poisoned 17 family members, of whom 3 died in 1924. She was convicted of one of the murders, although her defense claimed that she was mentally ill and that her lover had ordered her to poison her family. By 1906, she met Albert at a box social, and the two were married, though Albert neglected to give her a wedding ring. The marriage was not a happy one, and Albert died suddenly in 1922. Within a year of his death, Martha found new male companionship in the form of Walter Johns, who worked as a farmhand on property adjacent to her farm. The relationship was frowned upon by many, including her mother and her Aunt Lily, who made no secret of their desire for Martha to end the relationship. On Thanksgiving evening of 1924, several members of the family, including Martha's mother, Sophie, fell ill with a severe stomach ailment. The others recovered shortly after, but Sophie's illness worsened and she died on December 13, 1924. New Year's Eve brought more illness, and several family members were hospitalized. In total, 17 relatives were taken ill with similar symptoms in the fall and winter of 1924 and 1925. Within the family, 4 children were left partially paralyzed from the mysterious illness. After the deaths of the children, authorities began to investigate the cluster of deaths. The county sheriff soon discovered that Martha had signed a local drugstore for a series of purchases of large quantities of arsenic. An autopsy on Lily confirmed the presence of arsenic in her digestive tract. Martha was brought in for questioning by the sheriff, and she at first claimed she had obtained the arsenic to kill rats, but eventually confessed that she had used it to poison family members by putting it in water buckets and coffee pots the family drank out of. Despite her confession, Martha pleaded not guilty to the charges of murdering Lily in front of a grand jury on March 23, 1925. The defense claims included that Martha was criminally insane and that she was ordered to commit the murders by her former lover, Walter Johns. A number of setbacks plagued the defense, including the May 6th suicide of Martha's sister-in-law, Edith, and the subsequent collapse of her husband, Fred, both of whom had prepared to testify. The recantation of testimony by a man named Frank, who told the prosecution on cross-examination that the defense had asked him to support claims that Martha was insane. The jury deliberated for 6 hours before finding Martha guilty of first-degree murder. She was sentenced to life in prison. Lydia Sherman. Lydia Sherman, also known as the Derby Poisoner, was a notorious American serial killer who lived from 1824 to 1878. She was orphaned as a child and raised by her uncle John. Lydia married her first husband, Edward Struck, at the age of 17, and they moved to New York City together. However, after her husband lost his job and became depressed, Lydia poisoned him with arsenic in 1864. Over the next few years, Lydia continued to work as a nurse and caregiver, poisoning more children under her care. In 1868, she married her second husband, Dennis, whom she poisoned with arsenic after noticing his declining health. Lydia's third husband was Horatio Sherman. Her crimes eventually caught up with her, and she was convicted of second-degree murder in 1872 for the death of Horatio Sherman, but was not suspected in any of her other murders. While serving her sentence, Lydia escaped under the pretext of being sick and landed a job as a housekeeper to a wealthy widower in Providence. However, she was caught and imprisoned again before dying due to cancer. Faye Copeland. Faye Copeland was an American serial killer who, along with her husband Ray, was convicted of murdering 5 drifters in the 1980s. The couple, aged 69 and 76 respectively, became the oldest couple ever sentenced to death in the country. When Faye's sentence was commuted to life in prison, she became the oldest woman on death row. Ray was born in Oklahoma in 1914 and grew up moving around with his family during the Great Depression. He turned to petty crimes such as stealing livestock, forging checks, and served a year in jail. After his release in 1940, he met Faye and they were soon married. Due to Ray's criminal reputation, they had to keep moving their family around while money was tight. Ray served several jail sentences until he came up with a plan to improve his illegal money-making methods. Ray employed drifters and hobos as farm hands on his property in Morrisville, where he picked up cattle from the market and sold them quickly. Afterward, the farm hands would disappear without a trace, and Ray's fraudulent activities continued. However, after a previous employee, Jack, reported seeing human bones on his farm and that Ray had attempted to kill him, the police investigated further. Upon visiting the Copeland farm with a search warrant, dozens of officers, and a team of bloodhounds, the police discovered the bodies of 3 young men killed with a .22 caliber Marlin rifle. More bodies were found on the farm, and Ray was convicted of 5 counts of murder and sentenced to death in March 1991. When Faye went to trial in November 1990, her defense tried to portray her as a dutiful wife and mother who had endured years of abuse from her husband. However, she was convicted of 5 counts of first-degree murder. Ray later died of natural causes, and Faye's attorney appealed her conviction, arguing that the jury had not been allowed to hear evidence of Ray's abuse toward her for years. Eventually, a judge overturned her death sentence and commuted her sentence to 5 consecutive terms of life without parole. Faye suffered a stroke in August 2002 that left her partially paralyzed and unable to speak. About a month later, Governor Bob Holden authorized a medical parole for Faye, fulfilling her wish to not die in jail. She was paroled to a nursing home in her hometown, where she died of natural causes in December 2003. It is thought that the couple's motivation was purely financial. Ray and Faye's criminal activities took place over 3 years, between 1986 and 1989, during which they killed between 5 and 12 people. Diane Odell. Diane Odell, born in 1953, is an American female serial killer who gained notoriety for murdering 3 of her 12 children. Odell was also investigated for the disappearance of another child. The details of the case were gruesome, as Diane regularly traveled with the corpses of her victims. In May 2003, the bodies of the 3 dead newborns were discovered in a storage shed that Diane had rented and later abandoned. Diane told police that the babies had died at birth between 1981 and 1984. Shockingly, she had kept the 3 babies in a storage unit for over 10 years, displaying a disturbing lack of remorse for her actions. When she failed to pay rent for the storage unit, her landlord cleared out her possessions and found the corpses. The case quickly became known as the Baby in the Boxes murder case, and Diane's trial began in 2003, but they unanimously found her guilty of second-degree murder. This verdict reflected the jury's belief that Diane had committed the murders without premeditation. In 2004, Diane was sentenced to life in prison. Her earliest chance of parole is in 2029. Janie Lou Gibbs. Janie Lou Gibbs was an American serial killer from Georgia who killed her 3 sons, a grandson, and her husband by poisoning them with arsenic in 1966 and 1967. Born on Christmas Day, 1932, Gibbs was a member of the local church community and ran a daycare from her home. She was married to her husband Marvin for 18 years before she began her killing spree. Gibbs committed her first murder by poisoning her husband Marvin. She added arsenic to his dinner and brought him homemade soup containing more poison while he was in a hospital. After Marvin's death on January 21, 1966, doctors attributed the cause of death to liver disease. Janie was supported by the local church community after her husband's death and donated some of his life insurance money to the church. 8 months later, Janie poisoned her youngest son, Marvin. Doctors listed his cause of death as hepatitis, and Janie was not suspected of any wrongdoing. She donated a large portion of her life insurance payouts to the local church, and doctors listed his cause of death as a rare muscular disorder. In January 1967, another one of Janie's sons, 16-year-old Melvin, died suddenly, and doctors listed his cause of death as a rare muscular disorder. Janie's last son, Robert, had fathered a child named Raymond with his wife. Janie was excited to become a grandmother, but her grandchild became sick and died suddenly, followed only a month later by his father. Gibbs was arrested for murder on Christmas Day, and the bodies of her husband and 3 sons were exhumed, revealing that all 5 had arsenic present in their bodies. Initially, Janie was found unfit to stand trial. She was confined to a mental institution where she worked as a cook. Later, she stood trial and was sentenced to 5 life sentences. She remained in prison until 1999 when she was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease and was released into the custody of her sister. Janie died in 2010 in a nursing home. Mary Delphine McCarty. Mary Delphine McCarty was a New Orleans socialite and serial killer who tortured and murdered slaves in her household. Born during the Spanish colonial period, Mary married 3 times in Louisiana and was twice widowed. Rescuers responding to a fire at her Royal Street mansion in 1834 discovered bound slaves in her attic, who showed evidence of cruel, violent abuse over a long period. Mary's house was subsequently sacked by an outraged mob of New Orleans citizens, and she escaped to France with her family. Her house was burned by the mob. On the day of the fire, a 70-year-old cook, chained to the stove by her ankle, was found by the police and fire marshals. She later confessed to setting the fire as a suicide attempt because she feared being punished. It was thought that her house was burned down by the mob. As bystanders responded to the fire, they attempted to enter the quarters of those enslaved to ensure everyone had been evacuated. Upon being refused the keys, the bystanders broke down the door to the quarters and found 7 slaves, more or less horribly mutilated, suspended by the neck, with their limbs apparently stretched and torn from one extremity to the other. One of those who entered the premises was Judge Jean, who found, among others, a woman wearing an iron collar who was too weak to be able to walk. When the discovery of the abused slaves became widely known, a mob of local citizens attacked the residence and demolished and destroyed everything upon which they could lay their hands on. A sheriff and his officers were called upon to disperse the crowd, but by the time the mob left, the property had sustained major damage, with scarcely anything remaining but the walls. The slaves were taken to a local jail, where they were available for public viewing. The newspaper reported that 2 of the slaves found in the mansion had died since their rescue. The article added that in digging in the yard of the mansion, more bodies were revealed, including children. Mary's life after the 1834 fire is not well documented. Ultimately, it is suspected that she ended up in Paris. Lizzie Halliday. Lizzie Halliday, also known as Eliza Margaret McNally, was an Irish-American serial killer who was responsible for the deaths of 4 people in upstate New York during the 1890s. Her first victim was her mentally handicapped son, John, who died in a fire at their home in May 1891. Lizzie was suspected of setting the fire as she was known to have disliked her son. Later that year, she burned down the family barn and mill, and she attempted to run off with another man. She was arrested and sent to an asylum, but was released and returned home. In August of that year, Lizzie's husband, Paul, disappeared, and she claimed he had gone to a nearby town for work. After a search warrant was obtained, the bodies of 2 women, Margaret and Sarah, were found buried in hay in a barn on their property. They had both been shot. Paul's mutilated body was later found under the floorboards of their house, also with a gunshot wound. Lizzie was charged with the murders and held for trial. During her time in custody, Lizzie received national attention. The New York World called her case unprecedented and almost without parallel in the annals of crime. Lizzie had been married 5 times before she wed Paul, and 2 of her husbands had died less than a year after their marriages. She had also tried to poison a 3rd. The press speculated that she was responsible for at least 6 deaths. On June 21, 1894, Lizzie was convicted for the murder of Margaret and Sarah. She was the first woman to be sentenced to death by electrocution via New York State's new electric chair. However, the governor commuted her sentence to life in a mental institution after a medical commission declared her insane. This is where she spent the remainder of her life. Lizzie became a model patient and was trusted with sewing privileges, which gave her access to scissors. She grew close to Nellie Wicks, one of the attendants at the facility, but was upset when Nellie planned to leave the institution. In 1906, Lizzie killed Nellie by stabbing her 200 times with a pair of scissors. Lizzie ultimately died of Bright's disease on June 28, 1918, after spending nearly half her life in the asylum. Vicki Dawn Carson Jackson. Vicki Jackson is an American serial killer who killed at least 10 patients in Texas between 2000 and 2001. Despite protesting her innocence, she was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to life in prison. Little is publicly known about Vicki's early life. Vicki was a licensed vocational nurse since 1989 who worked at several other hospitals and a nursing home around North Texas. She ultimately ended up working at a hospital that mostly treated elderly patients with slight ailments, all of whom were between the ages of 62 and 100, and had previously been in healthy condition. While the victims were patients that were of advanced age and weaker immune systems, rumors spread around the facility that perhaps somebody had purposely began killing them. Subsequently, a joint investigation by the local police, the Texas Rangers, and the FBI was launched. They investigated the deaths of more than 20 patients who may have been poisoned. While exhumations from cemeteries in North Texas and Oklahoma were underway, newspapers revealed that a civil lawsuit had been filed on behalf of one polio patient, 61-year-old Donnelly Reed, who claimed that one of the nurses, Vicki Dawn Jackson, had injected a drug into his IV tube. After being fired from the hospital, Vicki found herself a new job at a local grocery store, where she was arrested on July 16, 2002 on charges of 4 capital murders. The authorities continued to exhume and examine bodies for further potential victims. At her second trial, FBI Special Agent David Burns testified against Vicki, revealing that in the course of several interrogations with her, he determined that she had killed the patients in fits of anger for being too demanding, and that she had attempted to injure several others, including a 14-year-old girl and a 40-year-old woman suffering from Crohn's disease. As pressed as to why she felt the need to kill them, she simply replied that she did not know. In the end, Vicki pleaded guilty to the 10 capital murder charges, accepting the life sentence in exchange for avoiding a jury trial and having her daughter testify against her, which was met with lukewarm reception. She and her defense team attended an evidentiary hearing in 2015, seeking a new trial and a dismissal of writ, but no results had been reported of that endeavor. She remains incarcerated, with her earliest possible parole date being in 2042. Juanita Hoyt. Juanita Hoyt was an American serial killer who was convicted of killing all 5 of her biological children. Juanita dropped out of high school in the 10th grade to marry Tim. James Hoyt was one of their children, and he was the longest surviving biological child they had. He died at 28 months old. All of Juanita's other biological children died before turning 6 months old. They all died between 1965 and 1971. For more than 20 years, it was believed that the babies had died of sudden infant death syndrome, SIDS. In 1985, a prosecutor in a neighboring county who had been dealing with a murder case initially thought to involve SIDS was told by one of his experts Dr. Linda Norton, a forensic pathologist from Dallas, Texas, that there may be a serial killer in the area. The pathologist arrived at this suspicion after viewing Juanita's case, in which the family were not identified by name. When the prosecutor became the district attorney in 1992, he tracked the case down and sent it to the forensic pathologist, Michael Baden, for a review. This pathologist concluded that the deaths were the result of murder. By 1994, Juanita was approached at the post office by a New York State trooper with whom she was acquainted. He asked her for help in research he was doing on SIDS, and she agreed. She was then questioned by the trooper and 2 other policemen. At the end of the questioning, she confessed to the murders of all 5 of her children by suffocation, and she was arrested. The reason that she gave for the murders was that the babies were crying and she wanted to silence them. Juanita later recanted her confession, and its validity was an important issue during the trial. A psychiatrist hired by the prosecution agreed that Juanita had been manipulated by the police tactics. Nevertheless, Juanita was convicted in April 1995 and sentenced to 75 years to life, 15 years for each murder, to be served consecutively. Juanita died in prison of pancreatic cancer in August 1998. Megan Huntsman. Megan Huntsman was a notorious American serial killer who murdered 6 of her newborn babies shortly after giving birth to them in Utah between 1996 and 2006. Her crimes went undiscovered until 2014, when her ex-husband, Darren West, found a small white box containing the decomposing body of a baby while cleaning out their garage. Darren continued to search the scene and found 6 other bodies, one of which was determined to be stillborn after an autopsy. Megan had murdered her children minutes after delivering them. Megan was the oldest child of an industrial painter and a mother who worked at a grocery store. She was raised in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, but had not been active by the time of her arrest, according to her uncle. She met her would-be husband, Darren, in high school. They got married shortly after she turned 18. Their marriage eventually deteriorated into substance abuse and violence, and Darren was imprisoned between 2006 and 2014 after being convicted of methamphetamine-related charges. Megan committed all of her murders by either strangulation or suffocation, then hid the bodies in boxes in her garage. She was a heavy methamphetamine user and reportedly did not want the babies. She even committed one of the murders while her husband and her brother and sister were in the house watching television. She was sentenced to all 6 counts, receiving 5 years to life in prison, with 3 counts to be served consecutively and 3 counts to be served concurrently. She is currently incarcerated at the Utah State Correctional Facility. Linda Laura Hazard. Linda Laura Hazard was a notorious American swindler and convicted serial killer who was known as the Starvation Doctor. She was the daughter of Susanna and Montgomery. Although she had no medical degree, she was licensed to practice medicine in the state of Washington through a loophole that allowed some practitioners of alternative medicine without degrees to practice. She claimed to have studied under Edward Hooker Dewey, a well-known proponent of fasting. Linda developed a fasting method that she claimed was a cure for all types of illnesses, stating that it rid the body of toxins that caused imbalances in the body. She wrote 3 books over the course of her career about the science behind fasting and how it could cure diseases. Linda established a sanitarium called Wilderness Heights, where she subjected her patients to fasting for days, weeks, or months on a diet consisting of small amounts of tomato and occasionally orange juice. While some patients survived and publicly endorsed her methods, dozens died under her care. Linda claimed that the deceased had succumbed to undisclosed and undiagnosed illnesses such as cancer or psoriasis of the liver. Her opponents claimed that they all died of starvation. Local residents referred to the sanitarium as Starvation Heights. In 1912, Hazard was convicted of manslaughter for the death of a wealthy British woman who weighed less than 50 pounds at the time of her death. At the trial, it was proven that Linda had forged Claire's will and stolen most of her valuables. Claire's sister, Dorothea, also underwent the treatment, and it is alleged that she only survived because a family friend showed up in time to remove her from the Wilderness Heights, weighing less than 60 pounds. She later testified against Linda at trial. Linda was sentenced between 2 and 20 years in prison. She was released on parole after serving 2 years and received a full pardon from Governor Ernest Lister the following year. Linda and her husband, Samuel, moved to New Zealand, where she practiced as a dietitian. A newspaper reported that Linda held a practicing certificate from the Washington State Medical Board. She was charged under the Medical Practitioners Act for practicing medicine while not registered to do so, found guilty and fined €5 plus costs. 3 years later, she returned to Washington, opened a new sanitarium known publicly as a School of Health, since her medical license had been revoked, and continued to supervise fasts until the sanitarium burned down in 1935. It was never rebuilt. Linda died of starvation in 1938 while attempting a fasting cure. Rita Mays. Rita Mays was born in 1975. She is a convicted American serial killer who murdered at least 7 elderly military veterans by injecting them with lethal doses of insulin while she was working as a nursing assistant in West Virginia. She committed the murders between 2017 and 2018. Rita received a life sentence for each murder, and she also received a 20-year sentence for 1 count of assault with intent to commit murder. Rita started working as a nursing assistant in 2015 with no certification or license to care for patients. She was assigned to work overnight shifts on Ward 3A of the hospital. Over the course of 11 months, elderly patients began suffering from acute drops in their blood sugar levels, and hospital staff eventually attributed the deaths of several patients to hypoglycemia. An internal investigation into 11 deaths was launched, and Rita was fired from the hospital in 2018. The investigation into the deaths of the elderly military veterans began in 2018 and lasted over 2 years. During the course of the investigation, Rita was questioned 3 times and denied any involvement in the deaths. Investigators built up a strong circumstantial case against Rita, including her internet search history, Netflix viewing of a series about female serial killers, and a phone call made to her husband, who was serving time in jail for child indecency charges. The investigation involved over 300 interviews, reviewing phone, social media, and computer records, thousands of pages of medical records and charts, hours of consulting with forensic experts, and the exhumation of some of the bodies of those who were deemed to have died suspiciously. And authorities later stated that Rita had been a person of interest from the beginning. Rita was officially arrested in 2020 and charged with the murders of 8 individuals. The charges were later reduced to 7 second-degree murders and 1 count of intent to commit murder involving the death of a 92-year-old United States Navy veteran. Rita pleaded guilty to all the charges. She admitted to murdering the patients and offered no motive, but claimed to be taking medication for post-traumatic stress disorder. On May 11, 2021, Rita was sentenced to 7 consecutive life sentences plus 20 years. Jean Weber. Jean Weber was a French serial killer who strangled at least 10 children, including her own. Born in a small fishing village in western France, Jean left for Paris at the age of 14 and worked various menial jobs until she married in 1893. Jean's husband was an alcoholic, and 2 of their 3 children died in 1905. By then, Jean was also drinking heavily and residing in a seedy Paris neighborhood. Jeannie was babysitting one afternoon, and one of the children suddenly fell ill and died. Strange bruises on her neck were ignored by the examining physician, and Jeannie was welcomed back to babysit their other child. The 2-year-old she was babysitting did not survive. A few weeks later, Jeannie was babysitting her brother's daughter when the girl suffered a sudden attack of choking, complete with red marks on her throat. The child survived that episode, but she was less fortunate the following day when Jeannie returned. A trial opened in 1906, with the prosecution alleging 8 murders, including all 3 of Jeannie's own children and 2 others who had died while in her care. It was alleged that Jeannie killed her son in March to throw suspicion off herself, but she was being defended by brilliant defense lawyer Henry Robert, and jurors were reluctant to believe the worst about a grieving mother. Soon after, she was acquitted. 14 months later, on April 7, 1907, a physician from the town was summoned to the home of a peasant named Bavouzet, he was greeted at the door by a babysitter who led him to the cot where a 9-year-old lay dead. The cause of death was listed as convulsions, but the doctor changed his opinion on May 4th when said babysitter was identified as Jean Weber. Held over for trial, Jean was released in December. After a second autopsy blamed the boy's death on typhoid. Jean quickly dropped from sight, surfacing next as an orderly at a child's hospital run by friends who sought to make up for the wrongs that justice has inflicted upon an innocent woman. At one point, Jean was arrested and briefly confined to an asylum in Paris, but doctors there pronounced her sane and set her free. By 1908, Jean was found strangling the innkeeper's son, 10-year-old Marcel, with a bloody handkerchief. Held for trial on murder charges, Jean was declared insane on October 25, 1908, and was taken to an asylum. Jean killed at least 10 children. She was in jail for 10 years before strangling herself in 1918. Sarah Jane Robinson. Sarah Robinson, also known as the Boston Borgia, was a notorious serial killer who poisoned her family members and other people from 1881 to 1886. She had 2 accomplices who aided her in her crimes. Sarah was initially sentenced to death for the poisoning of her brother-in-law, but the verdict was later charged to life imprisonment. Sarah's murders were discovered when several members of the Robinson family passed away from mysterious illnesses, all with similar symptoms such as excruciating stomach pain and vomiting. Sarah supervised the administration of all medicine and called a different physician each time the victims needed medical attention. Curiously, all the deceased except for one had life insurance policies through the United Order of Pilgrim Fathers. Sarah's son William died, but not before pointing at his mother as the one responsible for his condition. A doctor preserved parts of William's stomach for later analysis at Harvard College, which revealed large quantities of arsenic. The doctor informed the authorities, who swiftly arrested Sarah and her accomplices. Sarah and her accomplices were indicted for 2 of the murders, with all of them pledging not guilty on every charge. The grand jury later revealed 4 more indictments against Sarah. During the whole ordeal, Sarah tried to feign insanity, but this was later refuted by a doctor. The trial against Sarah for the murders of her son and other family members resulted in a hung jury. She was then put on trial for the murder of her brother-in-law and was convicted and sentenced to death by hanging. However, her sentence was later commuted to life in prison, and Sarah died behind bars on January 3, 1906. Michelle Notek. Michelle Notek, a convicted murderer from Raymond, Washington, was sentenced to 22 years in prison in 2004 for her role in the torture and deaths of Kathy and Ronald, which of whom were boarders in her home. Her husband, David, was also convicted of the murder of her 17-year-old nephew, Shane, who lived with them. Michelle is also suspected of possible involvement in the death of a member named James, whose assets she inherited after he died while she was employed as his caregiver. Kathy Loreno, a hairdresser, moved in with Michelle and David in 1991 after an argument with her family. During her stay, Kathy allegedly suffered physical abuse. When Kathy was reported missing in 1994, Michelle and David stated that she had run away with a truck driver and moved to California. However, a private investigator hired by Kathy's brother concluded she had probably been murdered by Michelle. Shane, Michelle's nephew, lived with them. After Kathy's disappearance in 1994, Shane seemingly vanished too. Investigators alleged that David killed Shane because Michelle was enraged that Shane took pictures documenting the abuse of Kathy. David later claimed that he had shot Shane. In 2003, Ronald, one of the renters, went missing. David later admitted to burying Ronald's body on their property after Michelle told him that Ronald had committed suicide. Witnesses described seeing Ronald being forced to do chores outside, wearing only his underwear, and to jump from the second-story roof onto gravel, causing broken bones and severe lacerations. Michelle would burn Ronald's injured feet with boiling water and pure bleach. Michelle entered a plea deal and pleaded guilty to 1 count of second-degree murder and 1 count of manslaughter. David was charged with first-degree murder in the death of Shane, and he was also charged with rendering criminal assistance and unlawful disposal of human remains. The prosecutor stated that Michelle showed extreme indifference to human life. Michelle served approximately 18 years and was released on November 8, 2022. David was sentenced to 15 years in prison for the second-degree murder of Shane. He served approximately 13 years before being paroled in 2016. Christine Malvray. Christine Malvray, a former nurse born on January 10, 1970, was arrested in 1998 on suspicion of killing up to 30 patients. She initially confessed to some of the murders, but later recanted, claiming that the patients asked her to do so as they were terminally ill. However, France does not recognize a right to die, and the families of the victims denied that their relatives had expressed any will to die or asked Christine to kill them. Christine's charge was later upgraded to murder, and she was accused of having a morbid fascination with death and disease. Christine's trial started in 2003, and she faced up to life imprisonment. She admitted to injecting lethal doses of morphine and potassium, among other drugs, into 4 patients, and claimed that they had asked to die. She stated that she helped them to end their suffering out of compassion, not because she wanted to kill them. However, prosecutors argued that Christine killed for her own sake and not for the good of her patients, and families of the deceased agreed with the prosecution, denying that their relatives had ever asked to die. After a 4-hour deliberation, Christine was sentenced to 10 years in prison for the murder of 6 of the 7 patients she was accused of killing, and she was permanently banned from working as a nurse. Christine's case sparked a national debate over the controversial topic of euthanizing patients in France. Her arrest initially received public support, with over 5,000 letters expressing support and appreciation for her acts of compassion, and the media described her as a model nurse helping terminally ill patients. However, details of the case were leaked, revealing that the terminally ill patients did not want or ask Christine to aid in their suicides. Public opinion quickly turned against her, and the principal French association supporting the right to die dropped its support. Irina Gatamachuk. Irina Gatamachuk was born in the Soviet Union on May 22, 1972. Her parents lost their parental authority as a result of her alcohol addiction at a young age. She moved in the early 1990s and married her husband Yuri, who refused to provide her with money out of fear that she would spend it on alcohol. In 2002, Irina began killing elderly women. She posed as a social worker to gain access to their homes and then killed them with an axe or hammer. After killing them, she would rob them of any money she could find and sometimes set fire to the house to cover her tracks. Police suspected that the deaths were linked but struggled to find leads. Most of the murders occurred in one city, with some taking places in others. In 2010, Irina attempted to kill another elderly woman who escaped and reported the attack to the police. The victim described the attack as a female, which led to a breakthrough in the investigation. Irina killed her final victim, Alexandra, whose neighbor saw her leave around the time of the murder. After receiving the neighbor's report, the police arrested Irina, who quickly confessed to the killings. In 2012, her trial began. Although she initially confessed to the killings, Irina contested the charges throughout the trial. A forensic psychiatric examination showed although she had some mental illness, she was legally sane at the time of the murders. A few months later, Irina was charged with 17 counts of murder and 1 count of attempted murder. She was sentenced to 20 years in prison, the maximum possible sentence for women according to Russian law. The victims' relatives criticized the short length of the sentence, arguing that Irina should never be released. Marie Fikakova. Marie Fikakova was a Czech nurse who became infamous for her brutal murders of newborns in the neonatal department of a hospital in 1960. The department had capacity problems, and Marie was frustrated by the fact that 2 more children had been born on February 23, 1960, making the situation even more complicated. In a moment of anger, she grabbed a newborn baby girl by the head and squeezed so hard that she dug her fingers inside. The baby stopped moving almost immediately. She then attacked another baby, whom she had punched in the head several times earlier, and put her back in the box for isolation. This baby survived the attack but sustained severe injuries. After the attacks, Marie made coffee and took care of the other children. Then she called the emergency services to report that the newborn girl was behaving strangely. The investigation could not explain the death as postpartum complications, as she had been thoroughly examined previously. The authorities were suspicious, and an autopsy was ordered. The baby initially survived the attack, but died a little bit later. The baby did not die immediately, and she was lying there for hours in pain. Autopsies of both children confirmed severe skull injuries, and Marie was arrested on February 26, 1960. During questioning, Marie confessed to the murders, explaining that she committed them due to stress and frustration with the overcrowded neonatal department. Marie confessed not only to the murder of 2 children on February 23rd, but also to previous attacks. She often changed the motive of her attacks, citing earlier disputes with grandparents or a desire to take revenge on the Czech population that treated her family badly after the war. During a psychiatric examination, she admitted that if she had her own child and it was crying, she would be able to kill it too. The last chance for Marie was to prove that she was mentally incompetent, but forensic doctors found her sane, prone to depression, hysteria, and uncontrolled outbursts of rage. The death sentence was handed down on October 4, 1960, and Marie was executed by hanging in the basement of the prison. Donna Sue Gray. Donna Sue Gray, an American serial killer, murdered 3 elderly women in 1994 to support her spending habits. She was caught after a 4th intended victim survived and identified her. Norma Davis was thought to be Donna's first victim. However, because of the lack of evidence, Donna was never convicted of killing her. Norma was her grandmother. On February 1994, Norma was found dead with a wood-handled utility knife and fillet knife sticking out of her neck and chest. Detectives found no forced entry into the house, and a Nike shoe print pointed towards the kitchen. A few days later, Donna killed June Roberts, 66-year-old, by strangling her with the cord of her phone after visiting her and pretending to borrow a book. Donna then went on a shopping spree using June's credit cards. About a month later, Donna killed Dora Bebe, 87-year-old, just after Dora had come home from a doctor's appointment. Donna asked Dora for directions, entered her home, attacked, and killed her. An hour later, Donna used Dora's credit card to go on a shopping spree. Donna was finally caught because of her massive spending using the credit cards. Detectives interviewed the cashiers from the stores where Donna used credit cards and got a physical description of her. They learned that the killer had dyed her hair recently and had a son named Jason. A detective obtained a search warrant for Donna's home. After seeing Donna use Dora's credit card, the detectives had enough information to link her to the murder. They arrested Donna while she was cooking dinner for her family. Donna pleaded insanity on all accounts, but after a witness claimed to have seen Donna at June's house on the day of her death, she changed her plea to guilty of robbing and murdering 2 women and attempting to murder another. Donna was sentenced to life without parole and was incarcerated in the California Women's Prison, where she remains today. Suzanne Barnes Carson. Suzanne Barnes Carson, alongside her husband James, are a notorious American serial killer couple who were convicted of 3 murders between 1981 and 1983 in Northern California and the San Francisco Bay Area. The couple's first victim was their former roommate, Karen, whom they stabbed 13 times and crushed her skull before wrapping her up in a blanket and hiding her body in the basement. After fleeing to a mountain hideout in Oregon, they moved to Alder Point, California, where they worked on a marijuana farm and became known as anarchists who advocated revolution and predicted an impending nuclear apocalypse. They had shot and killed Clark Steffens, a worker on the farm with whom he had a dispute, and attempted to dispose of the body by burning it and burying it under chicken fertilizer in the woods. 2 weeks later, Steffen was reported missing, leading to the discovery of his remains. The couple were considered suspects, but were difficult to track down. Later that year, Michael was picked up by police in Los Angeles, but was freed through a police error before detectives could question him. In January 1983, the couple were given a ride by a man named John, whom Suzanne deemed a witch and decided had to be killed. After a physical altercation, they gained control of the man's gun and killed him in view of passing motorists, leading to a high-speed chase and their eventual capture. The couple initially confessed to the murders, but later withdrew their confessions and entered pleas of not guilty. The couple claimed to have been pacifists and vegetarian yoga practitioners who converted to a form of Islam and described themselves as vegetarian Muslim warriors. Their crimes emerged from a shared mission to exterminate individuals they believed to be witches. They showed no remorse for their crimes and were suspected in nearly a dozen other deaths in the US and Europe. In 1984, the couple were convicted first of their roommate Karen's murder and sentenced to 25 years in prison. Later, they were convicted of the murders of Clark and John, for which they received sentences of 50 years to life and 75 years to life. Despite their disruptive history, the couple's case is noteworthy for the bizarre, pseudo-spiritual reasoning they gave for their murders. They believed their victims were witches and therefore deserved to die, which earned them the nickname the San Francisco Witch Killers. The couple remains incarcerated in California prisons to this day. Sylvia Segrist. Sylvia Segrist is an American mass murderer who committed a horrific crime on October 30th, 1985, at the Springfield Mall in Pennsylvania. Sylvia was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia 10 years earlier, killed 3 people, and wounded 7 others. Her case raised concern about the state's authority to commit at-risk individuals into mental care facilities versus individual rights. On the day of the incident, Sylvia made 2 trips to the Springfield Mall. During her first visit, she shopped for Halloween items at a party store, and then worked out at a fitness club. On her second visit, she retrieved a weapon she had purchased and began firing at people. She killed a 2-year-old and 2 men. Sylvia ignored some stores and fired into others, causing customers to flee. John, a local graduate student, eventually disarmed her and waited for mall security to arrive. When the first guard asked her why she did what she did, Sylvia replied, "My family makes me nervous." Prior to the competency hearing, Sylvia was transferred to a hospital for evaluation. On March 6, 1986, she was deemed competent to stand trial for the killings. Sylvia was found guilty but insane and sentenced to 3 consecutive life sentences and 7 consecutive 10-year terms. The judge believed Sylvia should spend the rest of her life in some form of incarceration. Sylvia was sent to a hospital for evaluation and later transferred to the correctional facility. Christine Falling. Christine Falling, born on March 12, 1963, is a convicted American serial killer. Cassidy was diagnosed with encephalitis. Christine was babysitting Cassidy in February 1980, and Cassidy died 3 days later. Her autopsy revealed that she died due to blunt force trauma to the skull, leading doctors to suspect Christine was involved in the death. Shortly after, Christine moved to Lakeland, Florida, where she was responsible for the death of 4-year-old Jeffrey and 2-year-old cousin Joseph, who passed away while under her care. Jeffrey's autopsy results pointed to an inflamed heart as the cause of death, while doctors suspected a viral infection caused Joseph's death. Christine left Lakeland and returned to her hometown in July 1981. She worked as a nursing assistant and housekeeper for seniors. And 77-year-old William died on the same day Christine began working for him. In the same year, 8-month-old Jennifer, Christine's half-sister's daughter, died of sudden infant death syndrome while Christine was with her. The turning point for Christine's death streak was the death of 10-week-old Travis. He died in July 1982 while under Christine's care, and doctors found internal injuries caused by suffocation during his autopsy. Christine eventually confessed to suffocating the 3 children with pillows and blankets because she heard voices telling her to kill the baby. Christine was sentenced to life imprisonment in December 1982. Her confession spared her from the death penalty. After 25 years in prison, Christine was eligible for parole. In November 2017, her application for parole was rejected by the Parole Review Board, and no one supporting Christine attended her parole hearing. She will be given another hearing in 7 years. Christine is imprisoned in Ocala, Florida. Kimberly Clark Sains. Kimberly Saines is a convicted serial killer who was found guilty of killing several patients at a Texas dialysis center. Her reign of terror began in 2008 when the clinic had an unusual spike in patients falling ill during treatment. Paramedics were called to the clinic 30 times in April, double the number of calls in the past year. One patient, Thelma, had to go to the emergency room several times due to getting too much heparin blood thinner. After 2 patients died of cardiac arrest on April 1, 2008, a clinical coordinator named Amy was sent to the clinic. Despite Amy's presence, the problems continued. Paramedics passed their concerns on to their superiors, who wrote state health inspectors and asked them to investigate. 2 patients suffered severe drops in blood pressure in the presence of inspectors on April 28, 2008. 2 patients testified that they saw Kimberly draw a bleach solution into syringes and inject the substance into the dialysis lines of 2 other patients. The bucket Kimberly was using, as well as the syringes, tested positive for bleach. Her nursing license was suspended and Kimberly was fired. Later, she was arrested for charges of 5 counts of capital murder and 5 counts of aggravated assault with deadly weapon. Police and the prosecutors were at a loss to prove that the bleach had indeed gone from the patient's dialysis lines into their bloodstreams. However, an analytical chemist and a bioterrorism expert was developing a test for measuring chlorine exposure. When the bleach entered the patient's bloodstream, it caused them to enter a process in which the red blood cells explode and release iron. This leads to cardiac arrest and death. On March 31, 2012, the jury convicted Kimberly of murdering 5 patients and injuring 5 others. She was sentenced to 5 concurrent terms of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for the 5 murders, plus 3 consecutive 20-year sentences for aggravated assault. Her defense team appealed, but the appeal was denied. She is currently serving her sentence at Mountain View Unit in Gatesville, Texas. Beverly Elate. Beverly Elate is an English serial killer who attacked 13 children, 4 of whom died, over a 59-day period. After the death of a child named Becky, medical staff became suspicious of the number of cardiac arrests on the children's ward, and police were called in. Beverly was found to be the only nurse on duty for all the attacks on the children, and had access to the drugs. Beverly was charged with 4 counts of murder, 11 counts of attempted murder, and 11 counts of causing grievous bodily harm. She pleaded not guilty to all charges, but was found guilty on each charge on May 28, 1993. She was sentenced to 13 concurrent terms of life imprisonment and is serving her sentence at Rampton Secure Hospital. In the 2018 documentary Trevor McDonald and the Killer Nurse, it was reported that Beverly had told close friends before her trial that she would never go to prison. After 1 week in prison, she refused to eat or drink and was moved to the Rampton Secure Hospital. 2 experts examined Beverly's mental state when she was arrested and concluded that she was not mentally ill and should be in prison, not a hospital. Beverly reportedly admitted to all 13 counts of her crimes in a failed application to remain at Rampton Secure Hospital and permanently avoid prison. On December 6, 2007, it was confirmed that Beverly must serve the original minimum sentence of 13 years. She was eligible for custody in November 2021, however, she is still in custody. Beverly's motives have never been fully explained. According to one theory, she showed symptoms of a factitious disorder, specifically factitious disorder imposed on another, also known as Munchausen's syndrome by proxy. This disorder involves a pattern of abuse in which a perpetrator ascribes symptoms to or physically falsifies illnesses in someone under their care in order to attract attention to themselves. Rosemary Pauline West. Rosemary West, a notorious English serial killer, worked with her husband Fred to torture and murder at least 9 young women between 1973 and 1987. She also murdered her stepdaughter in 1971. Rosemary is currently serving a life sentence after being convicted in 1995 of 10 murders. Fred died by suicide in prison the same year, while awaiting trial following the couple's arrest in 1994. Rosemary is believed to have killed her stepdaughter shortly before Fred's prison release date of June 24, 1971. She is known to have taken her stepchildren to visit Fred on June 15th. It is confirmed that her stepdaughter had been killed while Fred was incarcerated. In her testimony, Rosemary claimed that her stepdaughter had moved to Bristol with her mother, and she informed staff at the primary school that the child had moved with her mother to London. Her stepdaughter's body was initially kept in a coal cellar. Fred later buried her naked body in the yard close to the back door of the flat. It was noted later that the body had been severed at the hip. Several bones were missing from the body, leading to speculation that the missing parts had been kept as keepsake. Rena West, Fred's first wife, visited Fred's family to inquire about her children's whereabouts and welfare in the later half of August 1971. Rena sought to confront Fred, likely to discuss or demand custody of her daughters. This was the final time Rena was seen alive. Rena is believed to have been murdered by strangulation, possibly in the back seat of Fred's Ford. Rena's body was found with a short length of metal tubing, leaving open a possibility she had been restrained and subjected to a sexual assault prior to her murder. On August 6, 1992, Fred was arrested for raping his 13-year-old daughter 3 times, and Rosemary was arrested for child cruelty. The case against them collapsed on June 7, 1993, when their daughter refused to testify in court. This case brought to light the disappearance of Heather. This case brought to light the disappearance of one of their other daughters, who had not been seen since 1987, and triggered the major investigation that followed. After police found human remains and apparent signs of torture, Rosemary denied murdering any of the victims during her trial, but was still convicted of 10 murders, including her stepdaughter. Rosemary denied murdering any of the victims during her trial, but was still convicted of 10 murders. Some of her other victims included her own 2 biological daughters and son. Leonarda Cianciulli. Leonarda Cianciulli was an Italian serial killer, also known as the Soap Maker. She murdered 3 women from her neighborhood in 1939 and 1940 and used their bodies to make soap and tea cakes. Leonarda's motivation was to protect her eldest son from joining the Royal Italian Army during the Second World War. She believed that sacrificing humans would keep her son safe. Leonarda's first victim, Faustina, came to her for help in finding a husband. After luring her to her home, Leonarda killed her with an axe and used caustic soda to turn her body into soap. Francesca was Leonarda's second victim. Leonarda promised her a job and persuaded her to write postcards to her family detailing her plans. Francesca visited Leonarda before her departure and was given drugged wine before being killed with an axe. Virginia was Leonarda's third and final victim. Leonarda promised her work as a secretary and instructed her not to tell anyone. Virginia agreed, and during her final visit to Leonarda's house, she was given drugged wine and killed with an axe. Virginia's body was melted to make soap. Virginia's sister-in-law, Albertina, became suspicious of her sudden disappearance and reported her last sighting to the police. Leonarda was arrested and did not confess to the murders until they suspected her son was involved. She was tried for murder in 1946 and provided detailed accounts of what she did. She was found guilty of her crimes and sentenced to 30 years in prison and 3 years in a criminal asylum. Leonarda died in the asylum in 1970. Deborah Brown. Deborah Brown, alongside Alton, committed a crime spree across 6 states in the Midwest between May and July 1984 that resulted in the deaths of 8 people. Alton received death sentences in 3 states. Deborah was sentenced to death in Ohio and Indiana, but had her sentences reduced to life without parole and 140 years. Deborah had no history of violence or any criminal history before meeting Alton, although she was willing to participate in the crimes. In May 1984, Deborah and Alton committed their first murder, killing 9-year-old Vernita. Later that month, they sexually assaulted 2 young girls, and the younger, Tamika, did not survive the attack. On July 5th, Alton and Deborah arrived in Toledo, Ohio, where they killed Virginia and her daughter Rachel. They also entered the home of Frank and Dorothy, whom they beat and robbed. They went to stay with a reverend and his wife, whom they accosted with guns when they returned to the couple's home. The couple's car was stolen, and Deborah and Alton headed back toward Illinois. On June 28, 1984, Deborah and Alton entered the home of Mr. and Mrs. Palmer Jones, whom they beat severely. They stole their money and car. On July 12th, Toni, a 15-year-old girl, disappeared. Her body was discovered 8 days later. A bracelet that had been stolen from the temples was found under Toni's body. On July 13th, they drove away in a car belonging to Harry Walters, who they left unconscious, and his wife Marlene, who was raped and beaten to death. Harry survived and later testified that they had met the couple to discuss their potential purchase of a camper. Harry and his wife's car, as well as money, jewelry, and shoes, were stolen. 2 bicycles, clothes, and shoes not belonging to the couple were left behind. 2 days later, the vehicle was found abandoned in Kentucky, where Alton and Deborah had kidnapped Aileen, a college professor from Williamsburg, and drove back to Ohio with Aileen locked in the trunk of his car. On July 17th, they abandoned the stolen car and Aileen in the trunk. The couple was arrested 3 days after their last murder. As they walked across an intersection, a motorist who recognized Alton from his neighborhood notified the police. They were soon apprehended and taken to the police station, where they were both identified by their fingerprints. A shopping bag full of t-shirts and caps were found in the couple's possession, which led to the discovery that they would change their clothes every few blocks. Michigan was ruled out and Ohio was chosen to prosecute the couple, where they were found guilty of the rape and murder of Toni and Marlene. They were sentenced to death. Deborah's sentence was commuted to life imprisonment in Ohio by Governor Richard Celeste in 1991, due to her low IQ score and master-slave relationship with Alton. She expressed remorse for her crimes in 2005 when she apologized to the victim's family in a video. Deborah is currently serving her life sentence without the possibility of parole. Karla Homolka. Karla Homolka is a Canadian serial killer who was involved in the rapes and murders of at least 3 minors in Ontario, including her own sister Tammy, between 1990 and 1992. Karla testified against her husband, Paul, who was convicted of the murders of Maffei and French, and received life imprisonment and a dangerous offender designation. Karla claimed that she had been an unwilling accomplice in Paul's murders, resulting in a deal with prosecutors for a reduced prison sentence. However, videotapes of the crimes surfaced after the plea bargain and before Paul's trial, proving Karla was a more active participant than she had originally claimed. Paul scored a 5 out of 40 on the psychopathy checklist, in contrast to Karla's 35 out of 40. Following her release from prison in 2005, Karla settled in Quebec, where she married the brother of her lawyer. Karla and her first husband, Paul's first murder, was her sister, Tammy. According to Karla, Paul became attracted to her younger sister. Karla saw an opportunity to minimize risks, take control, and keep it all in the family, and hatched a plan to drug Tammy. In the summer of 1990, Paul and Karla served Tammy a spiked spaghetti dinner containing Valium stolen from Karla's workplace. Paul then raped Tammy for about a minute before she started to wake up. Later, Karla stole an anesthetic agent from a veterinary clinic, which is where she worked. On December 23, 1990, after a Christmas party in their house, they drugged Tammy with the animal tranquilizer. The couple subsequently raped Tammy while she was unconscious. Unfortunately, Tammy later choked on her own vomit and died. Karla and Paul hid the evidence, did the laundry, redressed Tammy, who had a chemical burn on her face, and moved her into her basement bedroom. Tammy was pronounced dead at the hospital without having regained consciousness. Paul told police he had unsuccessfully tried to revive her, and her death was ruled an accident. Their second murder victim was Leslie. Early in the morning on June 15, 1991, Paul took a detour to steal license plates and found Leslie standing outside her home. The 14-year-old had missed her curfew after attending a friend's wake and was locked out of her house. Paul left his car and approached Leslie, saying that he wanted to break into a neighbor's house. Unfazed, she asked if he had any cigarettes, to which he claimed he had in his vehicle. When Paul led her to his car, he blindfolded her and forced her into the car. He then informed Karla that they had a victim. Karla videotaped herself and Paul torturing and sexually abusing Leslie while they listened to music. Paul sodomized Leslie while her hands were bound with twine. They subsequently took Leslie's life. Their third murder victim was Kristen French. On April 16, 1992, Paul and Carla were driving around St. Catharines searching for victims. They saw Kristen French, a 15-year-old girl who was walking to her home from school. Paul attacked Kristen with a knife from behind and forced her into the front seat of their car. Carla pulled her hair from the back seat and subdued her. Kristen took the same route every day, taking about 15 minutes to get home. Her parents reported her missing when she did not return home. The police assembled a team within 24 hours and found witnesses who saw the abduction from different locations. They also found Kristen's shoe in the parking lot where she was taken. Over Easter weekend, Paul and Carla videotaped themselves torturing, raping, and sodomizing Kristen. The following day, they murdered her before going to their family's house for Easter dinner. Carla testified that Paul strangled Kristen for 7 minutes while she watched. Paul said that Carla beat Kristen with a rubber mallet before she tried to escape, and Kristen was strangled with a noose around her neck, which was secured to a hope chest. Kristen's body was discovered on April 30th, 1992, in a ditch in Burlington. Her hair was cut off and she had been washed. Carla testified that it was cut to impede identification. Carla attracted worldwide media attention when the plea bargain was made, and the deal was dubbed, in the Canadian press, the deal with the devil. Public outrage about the plea deal continued until Carla's high-profile release from prison. Mary Cowan. Mary Cowan was an American serial killer known as the Borgie of Maine. She poisoned 2 husbands and 4 children between 1884 and 1894 and attempted to murder a 3rd husband. After she was sentenced to life in prison and had died a few years later from unspecified illness, she was convicted of killing her stepson, Willis. Mary's life was marked by poverty, fraud, and crime. Mary was born as one of several children to Jonathan, a veteran of the Civil War, and Afia B. Knights. She lived in the family home until the age of 20 when she married the young farmer Willis. The couple had 3 children, Gracie, Alice, and Mabel. Alice and Mabel died from peculiar stomach aches. In 1884, Gracie was smothered to death, but no official investigation was made. Residents suspected that Mary had killed Gracie to get rid of her. Along with these tragedies, Willis, Mary's husband, still decided to pursue his medical career, enrolling into a dubious institution that sold diplomas for $25. This was considered fraudulent, and soon a state law was passed which prohibited the selling of fake diplomas. Willis confided to his parents that he would invest money in a farm in which he would live after returning to Maine. But Willis soon died mysteriously, similar to the children who died in the previous years. Mary then married Elias, a widowed farmer with an 8-year-old son, Willis, and young Willis was abused by Mary. A full set of farm buildings belonging to Elias mysteriously burned to the ground. Willis was brought down with heavy stomach pains after eating some green apples. Willis died in agonizing pain 2 days later. Due to Mary's dubious history of similar deaths, Willis's body was exhumed and his organs were sent for analysis. The autopsy results showed that the body contained heavy amounts of arsenic, enough to kill a full-grown ox. During her 1895 trial, ample evidence was presented, pinning Mary as the one who poisoned young Willis. The prosecutors proved that the dose of arsenic present in the body could have only been deliberate. Mary was convicted of killing her stepson. She was sentenced to life in prison. Joanne Denny. Joanne Denny is a notorious female serial killer from the United Kingdom. She is responsible for the Peterborough Ditch murder, which refers to a series of gruesome killings that took place in England in March 2013. The victims were all males who died from stab wounds, and their bodies were found dumped in ditches outside Peterborough. Joanne was later identified as the perpetrator of the murders. 2 other men were stabbed by Joanne as well, but they managed to survive. Joanne was subsequently sentenced to life in prison. The first victim was Lucas, who had met Joanne through their shared interest in drugs and alcohol. He was killed sometime between March 19th to the 29th of 2013. The second victim was Kevin. The second victim was Kevin, a property developer, landlord, and Joanne's lover. John Chapman, Joanne's housemate, was the third victim. Both Kevin and John were killed on March 29th, and Kevin's body was found the next day. Joanne had dressed Kevin's body in a black sequins dress before disposing of him. The bodies of Lucas and John were discovered on April 3rd with stab wounds. Joanne's friend Gary Stretch drove her to Hereford after the murders, where she attacked 2 men at random, both of whom were dog walkers. The men survived the attacks, but she stole the second man's dog. Joanne's motives for the killings were bizarre. She specifically targeted men during her killing spree, telling her acquaintance Lloyd that she did not want to kill women, especially not women with children. She wanted to kill 9 men in total and wanted to be like Bonnie and Clyde. Joanne stabbed men for entertainment and told Gary, "I need you to get my fun." She later told a psychiatrist that she found murder to be Moorish, and after the first killing, she got a taste for it. In November 2013, Joanne pleaded guilty to all 3 murders and 2 attempted murders. Gary was also sentenced to life in prison with a minimum term of 19 years for his role in the murders. Leslie, who had helped Joanne dispose of bodies, was sentenced to 14 years. Robert Moore, who admitted to assisting Joanne as well, received a 3-year prison sentence. Rhonda Martin. Rhonda Martin was an American serial killer and family annihilator who was executed in 1957 by the state of Alabama for the murder of her 4th husband, Claude. Rhonda used rat poisoning to kill her victims, including 5 of her 7 children and her own mother. She initially confessed to all of the murders, but later recanted her confession in the murders of 2 of her children. Rhonda was born around 1907. She worked as a waitress in Montgomery, Alabama at the time of her arrest. Rhonda was apprehended in March 1956 after her 5th husband, Ronald, was poisoned, like her other victims, but survived and was left paralyzed. Authorities looked into the strange deaths surrounding Rhonda, and she was eventually arrested. Prosecutors claimed that collecting insurance proceeds prompted her killing spree, but Rhonda denied this. In her trial, Rhonda was only convicted of murdering her 4th husband, Claude, but she admitted to committing every murder she was suspected of, except for 2 of the children. On October 11, 1957, Rhonda was executed by electrocution while holding a Bible in her hand. She reportedly remained calm, but wept quietly and recited the 23rd Psalm alongside the prison chaplain. Her executors had a slight mishap when they threw the switch activating the electricity before the electrodes were ready for use, causing Rhonda to wait several minutes until the electric cycle was finished. Rhonda was the last woman executed in Alabama until 2002. Charlene Gallego. Charlene Gallego, along with Gerald Gallego, were 2 American serial killers who were active mainly in Sacramento, California, between 1978 and 1980. They murdered at least 10 victims, mostly teenagers, often kept as sex slaves before killing them. In June 1983, Gerald was sentenced to death in California for the murders of Mary and Craig. 16-year-old Sandra was last seen in Sparks, Nevada on June 26, 1978. Authorities believe Sandra was Charlene and Gerald's first victim. 2 adolescents, Kippy, 16, and Rhonda, 17, vanished from a Sacramento mall on September 10, 1978. Charlene tricked them into going to the back of the couple's van as they were both shopping at Sacramento's Country Club Plaza. The girls were reportedly assaulted by Gerald all through the night. Finally, he pulled out a pistol and shot each of the girls once in the head. On June 24, 1979, 14-year-old Brenda and 13-year-old Sandra were abducted from the Washoe County Fair in Reno, Nevada. Both were persuaded to enter the van with the promise of earning money by distributing flyers. Over the next couple hours, Gerald sexually assaulted the 2 girls in the back of his van. Gerald then dragged Sandra toward a dry stream bed, removed a shovel from under their van seat, and yanked her out of the car. He repeatedly struck her in the head with a shovel. Charlene would later recall in court the assault, describing it as a loud splat like a flat rock hitting mud, and the girl sank to her knees and slowly toppled over on her face. On the morning of April 24, 1980, Gerald awoke Charlene and demanded, "I want a girl. Get up." After some time spent driving around, he came upon 2 teenage girls exiting a bookstore. Stacy and Karen, both 17 years old. Charlene approached the 2 females and invited them to travel with her in the van. She drove them to an isolated area where Gerald repeatedly raped them both. He killed Stacy with a gunshot to the head, and Karen managed to escape after being shot twice. Linda was 21 years old when she was abducted, murdered, and buried in a shallow grave. Linda accepted the couple's offer of a ride and was traveling with them in their van, until Gerald threatened her with a revolver while Charlene was driving. Linda was 4 months pregnant, and her body was found by tourists 2 days later. She had been buried alive, as sand was found in her mouth, throat, and nose. Her wrists and ankles were bound with nylon cord, and her skull was broken. On July 17, 1980, Virginia Mochel was abducted from the parking lot of a West Sacramento tavern where she worked as a bartender. Gerald sexually assaulted Virginia and then forced her to beg for her life. After strangling her, he discarded her body by a pond. Her skeletal remains, still bound with nylon fishing line, were found 3 months later outside of Clarksville. Craig Miller and Mary Sowers were forced into the couple's car on November 1, 1980, while leaving a fraternity party. Craig and Elizabeth were seen standing by the side of the road. Gerald ordered the two to get into the automobile after getting out of the vehicle. Gerald approached them with a gun and forced them to get into the car. After taking them to a remote location, Gerald ordered Greg out of the car and shot him in the back of the head. Then he fired 2 more shots into Craig's head while his fiancée watched. Gerald then took Mary into the bedroom of their apartment and raped her for hours. Afterward, he ordered Charlene to drive to a rural area where he shot Mary 3 times at point-blank range. Craig's lifeless body was found near Bass Lake, California. In the case of Virginia, loops of cord from her neck were admitted as proof of death by strangulation. A friend of Craig and Elizabeth witnessed their abduction and reported the car's license plate number. Police used this information to track down and arrest the couple. Gerald and Charlene pleaded not guilty to charges of kidnapping and murder. In June 1984, Gerald was convicted in Nevada for the murders of Karen and Stacy and subsequently sentenced to death. However, the Nevada death sentence was overturned in 1997. Charlene's attorneys were eventually able to convince prosecutors in several counties to allow Charlene to testify against Gerald for a plea deal that reduced her sentence to 16 years and 8 months. Charlene completed her sentence in July 1997 and was released. While in prison, she extensively studied psychology, business, and Icelandic literature. During an interview, Charlene claimed that she was also a victim and tried to save some of their lives. She also stated that it's taken me a hell of a long time to realize that I'm one of the victims who live. In 2002, Gerald died of cancer in Nevada Prison Medical Center while awaiting execution. The couple's gruesome crimes and the way they operated shocked the public and law enforcement alike. Their case remains one of the most horrifying in American criminal history, especially because of the young age of most of their victims. Céline Lesage. Céline Lesage, a French woman born in 1971, was found guilty in 2010 of murdering 6 of her newborn babies between 2000 and 2007. She suffocated 4 of them and strangled 2. On October 19, 2007, her then-boyfriend, Luc, found the 6 corpses in the basement of the home they were sharing. Each of the babies had been delivered in secret between August 2000 and September 2007, with Céline putting the babies and their dirty clothes neatly in a sealed plastic bag and hiding them. In one of the worst infanticide cases in history, Céline strangled 2 of her children with a cord and suffocated the other 4. During cross-examination, Céline admitted to the murders. She said, "Yes, I killed the babies. I did it. But I can't explain why I did it." Her horrific secret was uncovered when a new boyfriend was taken to the decaying corpses by her teenage son. It was stated that he was led to the cellar by the terrible smell of decomposing corpses and found them wrapped up in their bags. Céline admitted to killing her newborn children, but claimed diminished responsibility. She told police that she had absolutely no explanation for what she had done. Céline was sentenced to 15 years in prison for the murders. Elizabeth Wise. Elizabeth Wise, a German serial killer from Hamburg, was convicted and executed for killing 5 children. Elizabeth worked as a midwife in her youth and already had a daughter named Paula when she married Henrik. After being convicted of carrying out illegal abortions, she was prevented from practicing her profession. and tensions grew between herself and her husband. She tried to murder him multiple times, but was unsuccessful and was sent to prison after being convicted of several other crimes. Upon release from prison, Elizabeth offered her services as a child caregiver to women who could not raise their children themselves, or who had illegitimate children. Initially, she charged the mothers a one-time fee for handing over the children to adoptive parents, who in turn had to be paid. However, she did not always pay the adoptive parents, who returned the children to her, so she had to get rid of them. She informed the mothers of babies left in her care that she had had the baby adopted by rich families in distant countries. In reality, she poisoned the babies with morphine and burned their bodies in a stove in her apartment. Suspicions grew about the fate of these babies and investigations began. Elizabeth had to distance herself from the babies, so she forced her daughter Paula into prostitution. Paula fled to London but became pregnant. She returned to Hamburg and gave birth in a cellar. Immediately after the birth, Elizabeth drowned Paula's baby and burnt the body in the stove. The police searched Elizabeth's apartment and discovered her stock of morphine and poisons when they started investigating the case. She lived in St. Pauli, a suburb of Hamburg, and became known as the Angel Maker of St. Pauli. On October 10, 1904, Elizabeth was convicted in court of fraud, living off immoral earnings, and the murder of 5 children. She was executed by a guillotine in 1905. Myra Hindley. The Moors murders were a series of killings committed by Myra Hindley, alongside Ian Bradley, between 1963 and 1965 in England. They abducted and murdered 5 children, 4 of whom were sexually assaulted. The victims were aged between 10 and 17 years old, with at least 2 bodies remaining undiscovered. The arrests came after the murder of Edward Evans, when David Smith, an accomplice of Ian and Myra, alerted police. He went to the police station and reported the murder, armed with a screwdriver and bread knife in case Ian tried to intercept him. An officer went to Myra's home disguised as a bread delivery man and arrested Ian. Myra denied that there had been any violence and provided police with a key to a locked, spare bedroom where they found evidence leading to Ian's arrest. Ian and Myra were charged for the murders of 3 victims and received life sentences. The trial judge referred to the pair as 2 sadistic killers of the utmost depravity. In 1985, Ian confessed to 2 additional murders, leading to the reopening of the investigation. Ian and Myra were separately taken to the area where they buried bodies to assist in the search. Myra made several unsuccessful appeals against her sentence, but died in 2002 after serving 36 years in prison. Ian, who was diagnosed as a psychopath, died in 2017 after repeatedly requesting to die. Louise Vermiglia. Louise Vermiglia was an American Black widow who killed members of her own family, including 2 husbands and several other relatives. Starting in 1893, her actions only came to light after she killed a police officer, Arthur, leading authorities to become suspicious. Louise inherited $5,000 from her first husband. Louise inherited $5,000 from her first husband, Fred, after he died, but no suspicions arose as his death was believed to be due to natural causes. Following his death, Louise's 2 stepdaughters, Cora and Florence, also died at a young age. Louise was known for her interest in dead bodies and would often visit a mortuary in Barrington. Louise moved to Chicago in 1906, and it is here that she killed her stepdaughter, Lillian, after her husband Charles died. Her stepson, Harry, also passed away, with no suspicion arising in either case. In 1910, Louise's son, Frank, died, leaving her with an inheritance of $1,200. Louise began poisoning acquaintances, starting with Jason, who died after dining with her. Louise then married Richard, a trained conductor, who also died after eating food she prepared. Richard's estranged wife suspected that Louise killed him either because she loved him and feared abandonment, she was jealous of the undertaker thought to be in love with her, or she killed him for his money. Louise's motive for the earlier deaths of her family members was financial gain. It wasn't until the death of the police officer that Louise was caught. The police officer was poisoned with arsenic, and Louise was caught after being suspected of sprinkling white pepper over the meal she served him. Louise was placed on house arrest while awaiting trial. It was reported that she tried ingesting the white pepper substance in order to harm herself. Ultimately, all her charges were dropped. She led a quiet life following the dismissal of her charges. It is estimated that she gained around $15,000 from the 9 deaths. Helene Gigato. Helene Gigato was a French serial killer who poisoned as many as 36 people with arsenic over an 18-year period. She lost her mother at the age of 7 and was sent to work with her aunts. After 17 years, she became a cook for a priest, where she was accused of adding hemp to his soup. Her first suspected poisoning was in 1833 when she worked for a priest, where 7 members of the household died within 3 months. Over the years, she put 17 people in their graves before disappearing from the record. In 1850, Helene joined the household staff of a law professor at the university. The following year, another maid fell ill and died, arousing suspicion when Helene announced her innocence before being asked anything. 2 doctors examined the victim and convinced her relatives to permit an autopsy, which revealed the presence of arsenic. Helene was arrested on July 1, 1851. Helene was accused of 3 murders, 3 attempted murders, and 11 thefts. Her trial began on December 6, 1851. Her behavior in court was erratic, changing from humble mutterings to loud shouting and occasional violent outbursts against her accusers. She consistently denied that she knew what arsenic was, despite evidence to the contrary. Doctors who had examined her victims had not usually noticed anything suspicious. But when the most recent victims were exhumed, they showed overwhelming evidence of arsenic. A chemistry professor from the university was called as an expert witness at the trial. Later, inquiries linked Helene to 23 suspected deaths by poisoning between 1833 and 1841, but none were thoroughly investigated, since they were outside the 10-year limit for prosecution, and there was no scientific evidence. Locals attributed many unexplained deaths to her. However, some were very likely due to natural causes. The most reliable estimate is that she probably committed about 36 murders. Helene's crimes were linked to psychological problems. It is possible that these problems erupted at a young age after her mother died, causing her to develop abandoned child syndrome. Helene once stated that murdering people gave her a sense of power, which she enjoyed. Gwendolyn Graham and Catherine Wood. Gwendolyn Graham and Catherine Wood were convicted of killing 5 elderly women in Walker, Michigan in 1987. The 2 women worked at the Alpine Manor nursing home where they committed their crimes. Gwendolyn had moved to Michigan from Texas shortly before meeting Catherine, and the 2 became friends and then lovers in 1986. According to Catherine's account, Gwendolyn murdered their first victim, an Alzheimer's patient, in January 1987. Over the next few months, Catherine allegedly murdered 4 more Alpine Manor patients, many of whom suffered from Alzheimer's disease. Over the next few months, Gwendolyn allegedly murdered 4 more Alpine Manor patients, many of whom suffered from Alzheimer's disease. Catherine claimed that the couple turned the selection of victims into a game, trying to choose victims by their initials to spell murder. They then began counting each murder as a day, as in the phrase, "I will love you forever and a day." The investigation into the murders began in 1988 when Catherine's ex-husband went to the police. Catherine gave her version of the homicides, portraying Gwendolyn as the mastermind and hands-on killer. Catherine and Gwendolyn were apprehended. During the trial, Catherine plea bargained her way to a reduced sentence, claiming that Gwendolyn planned and carried out the killings while she served as lookout and distracted supervisors. On November 3, 1989, Gwendolyn was found guilty of 5 counts of murder and 1 count of conspiracy to commit murder. She received 5 life sentences and is currently housed in the Women's Huron Valley Correctional Facility in Michigan. Catherine was charged with 1 count of second-degree murder and 1 count of conspiracy to commit second-degree murder. She was sentenced to 20 years on each count and was released from the minimum security correctional institution in January 2020. Vera Renzi. Vera Renzi, known as the Black Widow or Miss Poison, was a Romanian serial killer who poisoned at least 32 individuals. including her 2 husbands, multiple lovers, and her son with arsenic in the 1920s. Before the age of 20, Vera married a wealthy Australian banker, Carl, who was much older than her, and they had a son named Lorenzo. While her husband worked, Vera remained at home, and she began to suspect that he was being unfaithful. In a jealous rage, she poisoned his dinner with arsenic and told everyone that he had abandoned her and their son. A year later, she claimed that he had died in a car accident. After allegedly hearing of her first husband's death, Vera remarried a man closer to her age, but the relationship was tumultuous, and she suspected him of having extramarital affairs. The man vanished within months of their marriage, and Vera told her friends and family that he had abandoned her as well. After a year, she claimed to have received a letter from her husband proclaiming his intentions to leave her forever. She had many affairs with married men and others openly, and all her lovers vanished within days, weeks, or months after becoming involved with her. Vera was caught after poisoning her last lover, a bank officer named Elate Ad. His wife reported his disappearance to the police, but they ignored her. She pursued her own investigation and found that Vera was her husband's mistress. She went back to the police, who visited Vera's home, where she admitted to having an affair with Elate Ad, but she claimed he had left her. The wife went back to the police and started asking questions about the other men who had disappeared after becoming Vera's lovers. The police obtained a search warrant and found a locked round cellar underground with at least 32 spaces, each containing a zinc-lined coffin. In the middle of the cellar, they found a red armchair, a big church candle, and an empty bottle of champagne. Vera confessed to poisoning all of her former lovers with arsenic when she believed they were unfaithful to her or when she suspected their interest was dwindling. She was convicted of at least 32 murders and sentenced to death. At the time, they were not executing women, so she was condemned to life in prison. During her trial, Vera showed signs of dementia, which worsened in prison, and she died in 1960. Dagmar Overby. Dagmar Overby was a notorious Danish serial killer who murdered between 9 and 25 children over a 7-year period from 1913 to 1920. She worked as a professional child caretaker, looking after babies born outside of marriage. Her methods included strangling, drowning, or burning the children to death in her masonry heater. She either cremated, buried, or hid the corpses in her loft. In 1921, Dagmar was sentenced to death in one of the most famous trials in Danish history, which changed legislation on child care. Her sentence was later commuted to life in prison. Dagmar's lawyer based her defense on her own history of abuse as a baby, but the judge was not swayed. She became one of only 3 women sentenced to death in Denmark in the 20th century, but all 3 were reprieved. Despite being convicted of 9 murders due to insufficient evidence of the others, Dagmar's case still sends chills down the spine of many Danes. She died in prison on May 6, 1929, at the age of 42. Velma Barfield. Velma Barfield was an American serial killer who was convicted of 1 murder but eventually confessed to 6 others in total. Born in rural South Carolina, she was raised near Fayetteville, North Carolina. Velma's father was physically abusive and her mother did not intervene. She escaped by marrying Thomas in 1949 and they had 2 children. However, Velma's hysterectomy and back pain led to drug addiction, and Thomas began to drink. On April 4, 1969, after Thomas had passed out, Velma and the children found their home burned and Thomas dead. In 1970, Velma married a widower, Jennings, who died less than a year later from heart complications. In 1974, Velma's mother showed symptoms of intense diarrhea, vomiting, and nausea, fully recovering a few days later. Later that year, during the Christmas season, her mother fell ill again with the same symptoms, dying in the hospital a few hours after being admitted. In 1975, Velma was convicted of 7 counts of writing bad checks and sentenced to 6 months in prison, released after serving 3 months. In 1976, Velma began caring for the elderly. 2 of the elderly victims, Montgomery and Dolly, experienced symptoms similar to those of Velma's mother. Velma later confessed to the murder of Dolly. In June 1977, a man named John Henry died soon after experiencing racking pains in his stomach and chest, along with vomiting and diarrhea. Velma later confessed to his murder as well. Another victim was Roland Stewart Taylor, Velma's boyfriend and a relative of Dolly. Velma mixed an arsenic-based rat poisoning into his beer and tea, and he died on February 3, 1978. Velma was imprisoned at the Central Prison in Raleigh, North Carolina, in an area for escape-prone prisoners and mentally ill prisoners. During her stay on death row, Velma became a devout Christian, ministering to prisoners. Velma's involvement in Christian ministry was extensive enough that an effort was made to obtain a commutation to life imprisonment. However, Velma was executed on November 2, 1984, at Central Prison. Amelia Satch and Annie Walters. Amelia Satch and Annie Walters, known as the Finchley baby farmers, who operated in London. Amelia ran a lying-in home where she advertised that babies could be left and accepted money for adoptions. Annie would collect the babies after they were born and murder them with a poisonous mixture containing morphine. The clients were mostly servants from local houses who had become pregnant and had employers keen to resolve the matters discreetly. They charged a lying-in fee and a present for future parents of £25 to £30. Suspicions arose as Annie's landlord was a police officer. The number of babies murdered is unknown, but it is estimated to be in excess of a dozen. During their trial, the quantity of baby clothes found at Claymore House was used as evidence to indicate the sheer scale of their crimes. A local campaign to commute their sentences to life failed, and they became the first women to be hanged in 1903. In what was the only double hanging of women to be carried out in modern times. The Finchley baby farmers' crimes were heinous, and their execution was a landmark moment in British legal history. Aileen Wuornos. Aileen Wuornos was an American serial killer who murdered 7 men in the span of 12 months. Aileen claimed that all her male clients had either raped or attempted to rape her, and she had acted in self-defense. Her story was later portrayed in the movie Monster in 2003, starring Charlize Theron, who won the Academy Award for Best Actress for her role as Aileen. Aileen's first victim was Richard Mallory, who she claimed beat and raped her after he drove to an abandoned area for sexual services. Richard was found dead 2 days later. Aileen's fingerprint was found on a receipt at a pawn shop that led to her arrest, and she was eventually convicted based on her own confession to the murders. In 1991, Aileen was arrested at a bike bar in Florida on an outstanding warrant. Her accomplice, Tyra Moore, was located in Pennsylvania and agreed to elicit a confession from Aileen in exchange for immunity from prosecution. 3 days later, on January 16, 1991, Aileen confessed to the murders. Aileen was eventually convicted for 6 of the 7 murders. She spent 12 years on death row and was executed by lethal injection on October 9, 2002. Enriqueta Repoles. Enriqueta Repoles, also known as the Vampire of Barcelona, was a notorious figure in early 20th century Spain. She was known for her involvement in child prostitution, witchcraft, and the kidnapping of children. While some researchers have disputed the extent of her crimes, it is clear that she engaged in horrific activities that terrorized the people of Barcelona. Enriqueta began her career as a prostitute, but soon became involved in child prostitution. She dressed up as a poor woman during the day and visited the poor parts of the city to abduct children, whom she would prostitute in her brothel. She also claimed to be a witch doctor and offered remedies made from the remains of the children that she killed. She claimed that drinking the blood of the children could cure tuberculosis and offered elixirs that could stop aging and prolong life. Enriqueta's crimes came to the public's attention during the tragic week of 1909, when she was arrested with a young man from a wealthy family and accused of running a brothel that offered sexual services from children. Due to her connections to Barcelona's high society, she was arrested but released due to lack of evidence. Over the next few years, more children disappeared, but as they were from poor families, police investigations were minimal. It is suspected that she kidnapped a large number of children over a span of 20 years. She was finally arrested in a flat in El Raval, and more evidence was found in flats in Barcelona where she had lived previously. Forensic experts were able to differentiate 12 children with the little evidence they were able to recover. Despite suspicions, experts are unsure if Enriqueta was Spain's deadliest killer. It is clear, however, that she acted for many years in Barcelona and that many children disappeared without a trace, causing dread among the population, earning her the moniker the Vampire of Barcelona. Belle Gunness. Belle Gunness was a serial killer active in Illinois and Indiana in 1884 to 1908. She believed to have killed at least 14 people, mostly men she enticed to visit her Indiana property through personal ads, but some sources speculate she was involved in as many as 40 murders. Belle's actual fate is unknown, although she was thought to have had died in a fire in 1908. It is believed that she faked her death. Belle married Mads Sorensen, and 2 babies in their home died from inflammation of the large intestine. Belle insured both children and collected a large insurance check after each death. Mads also died, and Belle collected money from both insurance policies that were active at the time, making a total of $5,000. With the insurance money, she moved to Indiana and bought a pig farm. In 1902, Belle married Peter, and his infant daughter died in Belle's care a week later. Peter died 8 months later from a skull injury. Belle collected $3,000 in insurance money for Peter's death. Belle began placing marriage ads in Chicago newspapers in 1905. Her ads were answered by Henry and John. Henry wrote his family requesting that they send him seed potatoes, but they never heard from him again. John withdrew a large amount of cash before traveling to Indiana and was never seen again. In April 1908, Belle's farmhouse burned to the ground, and the bodies of a headless adult woman, initially identified as Belle, and her 3 children were found. Further investigation found the partial remains of at least 11 additional people on the property. The discovery of the bodies led to the inspection of the site revealed dozens of graves in the yard, and further digging yielded multiple burlap sacks containing torsos, hands, and arms hacked from the shoulders down. In each case, the body had been butchered in the same manner, and blunt trauma and gashes characterized the skulls that were found that had been separated from the bodies. The case remains unsolved, and Belle's actual fate remains a mystery. However, her crimes have gone down in history as one of the most gruesome and unsettling true crime cases. Dorothea Puente. Dorothea Puente was an American serial killer who ran a boarding house in Sacramento, California during the 1980s. She targeted elderly and mentally disabled renters, murdered them, and cashed their Social Security checks. Dorothea's total count of murders reached 9. She was convicted of 3, and the jury hung on the other 6. Newspapers dubbed her the Death House Landlady. Dorothea's first murder was that of Ruth, a 53-year-old woman who lived in the upstairs apartment. Ruth died from an overdose of codeine. The authorities left the cause of death as undetermined, but suspicions were aroused when Malcolm, a 74-year-old, accused Dorothea of drugging and stealing from him. Dorothea was convicted of 3 theft charges and sentenced to 5 years in prison. After serving 3 years of her sentence, Dorothea was released and began corresponding with Everson, a 77-year-old retiree from Oregon. Their relationship developed quickly, and the couple was soon making wedding plans. In November 1985, Dorothea hired a man named Ismail to install some wood paneling in her apartment. She then asked him to transport the filled, sealed box to a storage depot. Dorothea told him to dump the box on the river bank at an unofficial household junk dumping site, and a fisherman found the box and called the police on January 1, 1986. Dorothea continued to accept elderly renters and collected tenants' mail before they saw it. During this period, parole agents visited Dorothea at least 15 times, but no violations were ever noted. Suspicion was first aroused when neighbors noticed the odd activities of a homeless alcoholic known only as Chief, whom Dorothea stated she had adopted and hired as her handyman. Chief later disappeared. On November 11, 1988, police inquired after the disappearance of tenant Alvaro, known as Bert, a developmentally disabled man with schizophrenia, who had been reported missing by a social worker. After noticing disturbed soil on the property, they uncovered the body of tenant Leona, 78. 7 bodies were eventually found buried on the property. Dorothea was charged with a total of 9 murders. Dorothea was convicted of 3 murders, although the jury could not agree on the other 6. Under the law, Dorothea received a life sentence without the possibility of parole. She was incarcerated at Central California Women's Facility. For the rest of her life, she maintained her innocence, insisting that all of her renters had died of natural causes. Mary Beth Tinning. Mary Beth Tinning was a convicted murderer and suspected serial killer in the United States. She was found guilty of killing her 9th child, Tammy, on December 20th, 1985, and was believed to be involved in the deaths of her previous 8 children, which all happened within a span of 14 years. They had their first child, Barbara, followed by Joseph. Mary Beth's father died of a heart attack in October 1971. Mary Beth's husband, Joseph, was hospitalized due to poisoning, which she later admitted to causing by putting pills into his grape juice. Despite this incident, Joseph declined to press charges against her. The Tinnings' 3rd child, Jennifer, died in 1972 at only 1 week old due to meningitis and multiple brain abscesses. 2-year-old Joseph died 2 weeks later after being rushed to the emergency room for supposed seizure and choking on his own vomit. Their daughter Barbara died the same year from Reye syndrome. Their son Timothy was born and died 10 days later, attributed to sudden infant death syndrome, SIDS. Nathan, the 5th child, died in autumn 1975 in the car while out with Mary Beth. Jonathan, the 8th child, died in 1980 after being on life support in Albany for 4 weeks. Michael, the 7th child and only adopted one, fell down the stairs in February 1981 and died soon after. Tammy, their 9th child, was born August 1985 and she died 4 months later from being smothered. Mary Beth was suspected of killing Tammy due to her previous pattern of behavior with other children. At first, it was believed that the deaths of the first 8 children were due to genetic causes. Even when their 6th child, Michael, who was adopted and not of blood relation, died in 1981, no investigation was conducted. Mary Beth was eventually charged with Tammy's death, and in 1987, she was found guilty of 2nd-degree murder and sentenced to 20 years to life in prison. Mary Beth's pattern of behavior has led some to speculate that she may have been diagnosed with Munchausen's syndrome by proxy. This disorder involves falsifying symptoms of illness and injury to a dependent, leading to unnecessary medical treatment. Mary Beth served her sentence in New York and was denied parole 6 times. However, she was granted parole on her 7th hearing in July 2018 and was released on August 21st of that year. Daria Saltykova. Daria Saltykova, also known as Salty Chica, was a sadist and serial killer from Moscow. She became infamous for her torture and murder of many servants, mostly females. Early complaints about the deaths at her estate were ignored or resulted in punishment for the complaints, as Daria had connections with those in power at the Russian royal court and nobility. However, relatives of the murdered women were eventually able to petition Empress Catherine II. Catherine decided to try Daria publicly in order to promote her lawfulness initiative. Daria was held for 6 years while authorities conducted a detailed investigation, and the records of the estate were examined. The investigation revealed as many as 138 suspicious deaths, most of which were attributed to Daria. She was found guilty of killing 38 female servants by beating and torturing them to death. But the Empress was unsure how to punish her, as the death penalty was abolished in Russia in 1754, and she needed the support of the nobility. In 1768, Daria was chained on a public platform in Moscow for 1 hour with a sign around her neck reading, "This woman has tortured and murdered." Many people came to look at her and ridiculed her. Daria was then taken to the cellar of life imprisonment and died on December 9, 1801. Maria Catherine von der Linden Swanenberg. Maria Linden Swanenberg was a Dutch serial killer who was known to have murdered at least 27 people and was suspected of killing over 90 people. She earned the nickname Good Me because of her kind and helpful nature towards her neighbors, particularly in babysitting and caring for the sick and elderly. However, Maria's kindness masked her dark side, and her first victim was her mother Joanna, whom she killed in 1880. She then poisoned her father Clems, not long after. It was later established that Maria poisoned at least 102 people with arsenic between 1880 and 1883, with 27 of her victims dying, including 6 of her relatives. The investigation into her case involved over 90 suspicious deaths, with 45 survivors experiencing chronic health issues after ingesting the poison. Maria's motives for the crimes was to secure the payout of her victims' insurance or their inheritance. She had secured most of the insurance policies herself. Eventually, she was caught after poisoning the Frank Husen family in December 1883, leading to her trial beginning in 1885. Maria was found guilty of killing at least 3 victims and was sentenced to life in prison in the correctional facility, where she remained until her death in 1915. Maria was famously known for whispering, "Your face is killing me," in her victims' ears before stalking and eventually killing them. Her actions led to her being considered one of the most notorious serial killers in Dutch history. Jane Toppan. Jane Toppan, also known as Jolly Jane, was an American serial killer who committed 12 murders in Massachusetts between 1895 and 1901, confessing to a total of 31 murders. She carried out these killings while working as a nurse, targeting patients and their family members. Her ambition was to kill more people than any other man or woman who ever lived. Jane was trained to be a nurse, and during her residency, she used her patients as guinea pigs in experiments with morphine and atropine. She was fired from Massachusetts General Hospital in 1990 for claiming several more victims. Despite this, she flourished as a private nurse despite complaints of petty theft. Jane poisoned her landlord, Israel, and his wife. She claimed several more victims before moving in with the elderly Alden with his family, where she killed Alden, his sister, and 2 of his daughters. The surviving members of his family ordered a toxicology exam, which determined that they had been poisoned. On October 29, 1901, she was arrested for murder, and by 1902, she had confessed to 31 murders. Jane claimed to have derived a sexual thrill from patients being near death, coming back to life, and then dying again. She has been referred to as an angel of mercy, a type of serial killer who takes on a caretaker role and attacks the vulnerable and dependent. However, she also murdered for seemingly more personal reasons, such as in this case of Alden's family. It is possible that she was motivated by jealousy in the case of the murder of her foster sister. She described her motivation as a paralysis of thought and reason, a strong urge to poison. Jane even poisoned herself to evoke the sympathy of men who courted her. An article published shortly after her arrest reported that she would inappropriately touch her victims as they died, and attempted to see the inner workings of their souls through their eyes. Despite claiming her sanity in court, she was found not guilty by reason of insanity and committed for life in a hospital where she died at the age of 84. Juana Barraza. Juana Barraza, also known, translated in English as the Killer of Old Ladies, is a former professional wrestler and Mexican serial killer who has been convicted of killing 16 elderly women. While the first murder attributed to her has been dated variously to the late 1990s and to a specific killing on November 17, 2003, the authorities and the press have given various estimates as to the total number of victims, with estimates ranging from 42 to 48 deaths. After Juana's arrest, the case was officially closed, despite more than 30 unresolved cases. 2 others, Araceli and Mario, were also arrested in 2005 and called by police and media the Killer of Old Ladies. Juana's victims were all women aged 60 or over, many of whom lived alone. She bludgeoned or strangled them before robbing them. The search for Juana was complicated by conflicting evidence. At one point, the police hypothesized that 2 killers might be involved. The authorities believed that Juana was a psychopath who felt no remorse. Furthermore, Juana associated her elderly victims with her mother and believed that she was helping society by killing them. In order to gain the trust of her victims, Juana posed as a government official who worked in social welfare. On January 25, 2006, a suspect was arrested fleeing from the home of the serial killer's latest victim, Anna Maria. To the surprise of many who had supposed the killer to be male, the suspect detained was Juana, a female wrestler known professionally as the Silent Lady. Juana closely resembled a model of the killer's features, with close cropped hair, dyed blonde, and a facial mole, and was carrying a stethoscope, pensions form, and a card identifying her as a social worker when she was detained. Juana was tried in the spring of 2008 and was found guilty on 16 charges of murder and aggravated burglary, including 11 separate counts of murder. She was sentenced to 759 years in prison. Since sentences imposed in Mexican courts are generally served concurrently, but the maximum sentence under Mexican law is 60 years, she is most likely to serve the full sentence in prison. Janine Ann Jones. Janine Ann Jones was a licensed vocational nurse who was responsible for the deaths of up to 60 infants and children under the care at a hospital in San Antonio during the 1970s and 1980s. She used injections to cause medical crisis in her patients, which resulted in numerous deaths. Janine was convicted in 1984 of murder and injury to a child. Hospital officials destroyed records of her activities to prevent further litigation. After Janine was asked to resign, she took a position at a pediatrician's clinic in Texas, where she was later charged with poisoning 6 children. 2 puncture marks were discovered in a medicine bottle in the drug storage, which only Janine had access to. The bottle's contents were found to be heavily diluted with water, with only 20% of the vial's contents being of the original medication. Janine claims she was trying to simulate the creation of a pediatric intensive care unit. Janine was sentenced to 99 years in prison for killing 15-month-old Chelsea and 60 years in prison for nearly killing Ronaldo Santos in 1985. On January 16, 2020, Jones pleaded guilty to the murder of 11-month-old Joshua on December 12, 1981. As part of a plea bargain in which 4 other charges were dropped, she was sentenced to life in prison. She will not be eligible for parole until she is roughly 87 years old. Miyuki Ishikawa. Miyuki Ishikawa was a Japanese midwife, real estate agent, and serial killer. Along with her accomplice, is believed to have murdered at least 84 infants during the U.S. occupation of Japan. In the late 1940s, babies were kept at a facility, most of whom were born out of wedlock, and whose real mothers were too impoverished to properly raise them. Due to a decrease in foster parents, Miyuki neglected numerous infants, many of whom died as a direct result. Almost all other midwives employed by Miyuki were disgusted by this practice and resigned. Miyuki also attempted to gain payment for these murders. She and her husband solicited large sums of money from the parents, claiming that it would be less than the actual expense of raising their unwanted children. A doctor was also complicit in this scheme and aided the couple by falsifying death certificates. 2 police officers found the remains of 5 victims on January 12, 1948. Autopsies performed on these bodies proved that they had not died of natural causes. Miyuki and her husband were arrested. Upon further investigation, the police found the ashes of over 40 infants in the house of a mortician, and 30 more in a temple. In court, prosecutors asserted that the couple had murdered between 27 infants and 84. The Tokyo District Court found the couple guilty of 5 murders, including the 2 infants that were found alive but who passed quickly afterwards by omission, and sentenced Miyuki and her husband to 8 and 4 years in prison. Both Miyuki and her husband appealed the sentence. This led to Miyuki getting only 4 years in prison and her husband 2 years. There was a second appeal, and the Supreme Court of Japan rejected this. Kristen Heather Gilbert. Kristen Heather Gilbert was born November 13, 1967. She's an American former nurse and serial killer. She was convicted of 4 murders and 2 attempted murders of patients admitted to the Veterans Affairs Medical Center in Massachusetts. Kristen used massive doses of epinephrine, an untraceable heart stimulant, to induce cardiac arrest in patients. She then responded to the coded emergency, often resurrecting the patient herself. Kristen was on duty for about half of the 350 deaths that occurred at the hospital from when she started working there in 1989. Prosecutors said the odds of this merely being a coincidence was 1 in 100 million. Her only confirmed victims were Stanley, Henry, Kenneth, and Edward. However, it is believed to be closer to the 350 deaths that happened while she was working. Other nurses noticed a high number of deaths on Kristen's watch, but passed it off and jokingly called her the Angel of Death. In 1996, 3 nurses reported their concern about an increase in cardiac arrest deaths and a decrease in the supply of epinephrine. An investigation ensued, and Kristen called in a bomb threat to attempt to derail the investigation. Kristen left the hospital in 1996 amid a hospital investigation into the many suspicious patients' deaths. VA hospital staff members speculated that Kristen may have been responsible for 350 or more deaths, including more than 300 medical emergencies. At trial, prosecutors said she used a large kitchen knife in an assault in Massachusetts in 1988. They also said she tried twice to murder a person by poison in 1995. Prosecutors said Gilbert abandoned a patient undergoing cardiac arrest and then asked another nurse to accompany her on a check of the patient. On March 14, 2001, a federal jury convicted Kristen of 3 counts of first-degree murder and 2 counts of attempted murder. Though Massachusetts does not have capital punishment, her crimes were committed on federal property and thus subject to the death penalty. In 2001, the jury recommended a sentence of life in prison. The next day, the judge formally sentenced Kristen to 4 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole, plus 20 years. She was transferred from a prison for women in Massachusetts to Fort Worth, Texas, where she has remained ever since. Amelia Elizabeth Dyer. Amelia Dyer was a notorious serial killer from England who adopted and then murdered infants in her care over a 30-year period. After her husband's death, she turned to baby farming, which involved adopting unwanted babies in exchange for money. At first, she cared for the children properly, but some of them died in her care, leading to her conviction for neglect and 6 months hard labor. Later, she started directly murdering children by strangling them and disposing of their bodies. She was mentally unstable and was committed to several mental asylums. However, she survived at least one suicide attempt. She was finally arrested after the bagged corpse of an infant was discovered in the river. Amelia was found guilty of the murder of infant Doris and was hanged. It is estimated that she was responsible for the deaths of up to 400 children, making her a candidate for history's most prolific serial killer. Amelia's childhood was marred by mental illness of her mother, which taught her about the symptoms exhibited by those who appeared to lose their minds through illness. And a younger sister, also named Sarah Ann, died in 1845, aged a few months later. An elderly cousin had an illegitimate daughter who was later accepted as the daughter of the grandparents, who were Amelia's aunt and uncle. After her mother's death, Amelia lived with an aunt in Bristol for a time before serving an apprenticeship with a corset maker. After marrying a man named George, Amelia trained as a nurse. She learned of an easier way to earn a living from a midwife, Ellen, using her own home to provide lodgings for young women who had conceived illegitimately and then farming off the babies for adoption or allowing them to die of neglect and malnutrition. This led to the practice of baby farming, in which individuals acted as adoption and fostering agents in return for regular payments or a single payment up front. Many businesses were set up to take these young women and care for them until they gave birth. The mothers subsequently left their unwanted babies to be looked after as nurse children. Unscrupulous carers resorted to starving the farmed-out babies to save money and even to hasten death. Many children died as a result of these practices. Death from severe malnutrition would result, but the coroner was likely to record the death as debility from birth or lack of breast milk or simply starvation. Mothers who chose to reclaim or simply check on the welfare of their children could often encounter difficulties, but some would simply be too frightened or ashamed to tell the police about the suspected wrongdoings. Even the authorities often had problems tracing any children that were reported missing. Amelia had to leave nursing due to the birth of her daughter Ellen. In 1969, Amelia's husband, George, died, and Amelia needed an income. She then turned to baby farming to support herself. Amelia was taking keen to making money from baby farming and alongside taking in expectant mothers. She advertised to nurse and adopt babies for substantial one-time payments. For some time, Amelia eluded the resulting interest of the police. She was eventually caught after a doctor was suspicious about the number of child deaths he had been called to certify in Amelia's care. However, instead of being convicted of murder or manslaughter, she was sentenced to 6 months hard labor. Dyer had spells in mental hospitals. Amelia had spells in mental hospitals due to mental instability and suicidal tendencies. These always coincided with times when it was convenient for her to disappear. Amelia appears to have begun abusing alcohol and opium-based products early in her killing career. She returned to baby farming and murder. Amelia realized the folly of involving doctors to issue death certificates and began disposing of the bodies herself. She and her family frequently relocated to a different town and city to escape suspicion. Amelia was arrested on suspicion of murder. When authorities raided Amelia's residence, they were overcome with the stench of human remains, although no bodies were found. The babies that were eventually recovered each had white edging tape still wrapped around their necks. Amelia was later quoted as saying, "The white tape, that was how you could tell it was one of mine." They found the bodies of 2 infants, but she had no idea how many children she had killed. Amelia was charged with 1 count of murder, but upon a warrant being issued for her arrest in connection with Doris's death, she was found dead in her cell. It was suspected that she committed suicide by hanging herself with a piece of her dress. As we come to the end of our exploration of female serial killers in the Iceberg format, we are left with a profound sense of curiosity and wonder. What motivates these women to commit such heinous acts, and how do they justify their actions to themselves and others? One of the most prominent differences between male and female serial killers is the role of love and money in their crimes. While male offenders are often driven by sexual gratification or a desire for power, female killers may be motivated by love gone wrong or the need for financial gain. This can manifest in various ways, from the jealous lover who eliminates a rival to the woman who takes out a life insurance policy on her spouse. Another distinguishing characteristic of female serial killers is their frequent use of poison. This method offers several advantages, such as the ability to mimic natural causes of death and the non-personal nature of the act. Additionally, women may use poison to take down targets who are physically larger or stronger than themselves, relying on their trust or vulnerability to achieve their goals. While the exact motivations behind female serial killing can be difficult to pinpoint at times, research has suggested that they often stem from a complex interplay of factors, including childhood trauma, mental illness, and societal pressures. What female stood out to you the most? How do you think societal factors may influence the development of female serial killers? Thank you to our Patreons. We really appreciate your support. We want to give a big thank you to Dark Entries, Nexus, Big Pepperoni Pizza, Chrissy R, Catherine D, and Tony S. If you would like to get the extended and other content, feel free to join our Patreon today. Link in the description below. Thank you for watching, and join us next time when we explore the psychological maze of some of the most wicked people.